late 4th millennium BCE, a period of unprecedented human innovation that would give rise to the world's first urban civilizations. On the one hand, we find the Sumerians, an enigmatic people who settled in the fertile, sun-baked lowlands of southern Mesopotamia, nestled between the life-giving Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, in a landscape that demanded sophisticated and organized labor to thrive, they established a network of independent city-states, each a self-contained world of monumental architecture, intricate administration, and nascent literary expression. The Sumerian power base was inextricably linked to their environment. Their genius lay in mastering the unpredictable floods and harnessing the immense agricultural potential of the alluvial plain to produce a surplus of grain that could sustain dense urban populations. This bounty of barley and wheat provided the economic foundation for the world's first cities, complete with specialized crafts, formalized governance, and the revolutionary technology of written communication. To the east of this riverine world, across the flat plains and into the formidable Zagros Mountains, another great civilization was taking shape. The Elamites, whose heartland lay in the region known as Susiana, inhabited a dramatically different landscape. Unlike the resource-poor Sumerian lowlands, Elam was rich in what Sumer lacked: timber for construction, precious metals for adornment and tools, and hard stone for sculpture and architectural foundations. Their capital, Susa, stood as a crucial hub, strategically positioned at the crossroads of major trade routes that connected the Mesopotamian world with the vast Iranian plateau and beyond. This geographical advantage gave the Elamites a unique economic and political identity. Their power was not rooted in agriculture alone, but in their control over the flow of vital raw materials. They were not merely farmers and city builders, but master traders and guardians of crucial commercial arteries. While separated by geography and environmental resources, these two burgeoning powers were in constant contact. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The archaeological record from the Proto-Literate period reveals a shared cultural lexicon. Impressed clay tokens and cylinder seals found in both Uruk and Susa exhibit a striking similarity in their administrative motifs and artistic style, a clear indication of extensive commercial and diplomatic exchange. However, this interaction was not a relationship of equals. It was a rivalry born of divergent needs. The Sumerian city-states, despite their agricultural wealth, were a land of clay, utterly dependent on the Elamite-controlled highlands for the very resources that would allow them to build their temples and create their tools. This economic dependency fueled a deep and abiding geopolitical tension. The Elamites, in turn, coveted the agricultural richness and urban markets of the Mesopotamian plain, desiring a foothold in the most prosperous region of the ancient world. This fundamental clash of interests, the landlocked, resource-hungry urbanizers against the masters of the mountains and trade routes, set the stage for a rivalry that would come to define the history of the ancient Near East and produce a series of conflicts that would earn them a place in history as the world's first great imperial rivals. The ecological stage upon which these two civilizations rose dictated their political and social trajectories in fundamentally different ways. The Sumerian world was a creation of the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers whose annual floods were both an essential source of fertility and a constant existential threat. The unpredictable nature of these deluges meant that survival depended on a society's capacity for large-scale, coordinated action. To manage the chaos and harness the bounty, the Sumerians engineered a complex network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs. The construction and maintenance of this vast hydraulic system required an unprecedented level of social organization, a need that gave rise to powerful centralized institutions. Authority in the city-states was intrinsically linked to the ability to manage these public works, elevating the temple, and subsequently the palace as the preeminent centers of power. This reliance on a highly structured top-down society shaped a civilization that was urban, hierarchical, and deeply administrative, with its power concentrated in a few great city-states. In stark contrast, the Elamite civilization was a product of the highlands. The Zagros Mountains, a formidable natural barrier, provided not only defense but also a heterogeneous landscape that fostered a more decentralized and resilient political structure. Unlike the flat, unified plain of Mesopotamia, Elam's territory was a mosaic of valleys, plains, and mountain passes, each with its own local identity. This environment prevented the kind of grand-scale urbanism that defined Sumer, instead encouraging a dual society composed of powerful urban centers like Susa and a network of autonomous highland groups, including nomadic pastoralists. The Elamite political system evolved to accommodate this duality, balancing the authority of settled kings with the independence of mountain clans. This fusion gave them a unique military advantage, blending the discipline of urban armies with the guerrilla tactics and maneuverability of mountain fighters who were masters of their terrain. Furthermore, their contrasting geographies determined the flow of trade and the nature of their wealth. The Sumerian plain was rich in agricultural output, but poor in raw materials. It had no significant sources of stone, timber, or metal. This scarcity compelled the Sumerians to develop intricate trade routes and sophisticated administrative systems to import these essential goods from the outside world. The Elamites, meanwhile, were blessed with an abundance of these very resources. Copper, tin, and wood from their highlands were the lifeblood of ancient craftsmanship, and the Elamites, through their strategic control of the passes, became the essential brokers of this commerce. This geopolitical dynamic transformed their rivalry from a simple contest for land into a more complex struggle for economic and political control, with the Sumerians pushing east for resources, and the Elamites using their geographical position to assert their dominance. Thus, the rivers created a world of rigid organization and perpetual demand, while the mountains forged a world of flexible power and control over supply. The stage was set for a conflict born not only of ambition but of geography itself. The period spanning the late 4th millennium BCE witnessed a pivotal phase of human development, defined by a surge in urbanization and the advent of writing systems. This era, known archaeologically as the Proto-Literate period, provides the earliest substantive evidence for a complex, multifaceted relationship between Sumer and Elam. It was a time of dynamic contact where shared administrative and artistic conventions arose, signaling a relationship that was simultaneously cooperative and competitive. The archaeological sites of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia and Susa in Elam offer a parallel and telling record of this proto-urban development. Excavations at both sites have unearthed a remarkable trove of artifacts, from the simplest impressed clay tablets to sophisticated cylinder seals. These objects, which serve to manage resources and track commercial transactions, reveal a startling synchronicity in administrative technology. At Susa, archaeologists discovered tablets bearing early forms of pictographic script that bear a strong resemblance to the contemporaneous Uruk IV script. This shared system of notation, which predates the more developed linear Elamite script, suggests that Elamite administrators either adopted or were heavily influenced by Sumerian bureaucratic innovations. The presence of these Sumerian-style administrative tools in Susa's Acropolis layer indicates a profound level of institutional exchange, a relationship that was more than mere trade. It was an integration of administrative practices. Beyond the shared script, the art of this period further illustrates a complex cultural dialogue. The cylinder seals, a hallmark of both civilizations, depict similar iconographic themes. Scenes of animals in combat, heroic figures wrestling with beasts, and processions to temples can be found on seals from both regions. While the styles possess regional differences, the thematic content and overall function of these objects to mark ownership and authorize transactions were nearly identical. This artistic crossover implies that the exchange of ideas was not limited to commerce. It extended into the shared symbolism and social values of the elite. The widespread presence of these seals speaks to a sophisticated commercial network that relied on mutual trust and a shared understanding of symbolic authority. However, the archaeological record also hints at the undercurrent of competition that lay beneath this cultural exchange. While Sumerian administrative practices were found in Elam, evidence of Elamite administrative influence in Sumer during this period is far less common. This asymmetry suggests a power dynamic where Sumerian organizational systems were exported east, but Elamite systems were not adopted in the west. This one-way flow of influence, coupled with the strategic location of Susa at the mouth of the Zagros passes, places the Elamites in the role of a vital intermediary, an essential partner, but one who maintained control over the trade gateways. The very similarity in their administrative tools, initially born of trade, likely evolved into a mechanism of competition. As both civilizations grew, their shared systems would be used to manage rival spheres of influence and assert dominance over contested territories and resources. The Proto-Literate period, therefore, was not merely a prelude to later wars, but a crucible in which the rivalry was forged. The cultural and administrative ties that linked Sumer and Elam served not as a permanent bridge of friendship, but as a foundation upon which a complex and enduring geopolitical contest would be built. The archaeological findings from this formative era demonstrate that the conflict between these two great powers began not with military conquest, but with a more subtle and fundamental struggle for economic and institutional supremacy. The transition from a proto-urban world to one defined by formalized states and dynastic rule marks a critical shift in the history of Sumer and Elam. This period is illuminated by the Sumerian King List, a cuneiform document that provides a framework for understanding the emergence of organized governance. This text, meticulously compiled by ancient scribes, served to legitimize royal authority by presenting a continuous, divinely sanctioned line of rulers stretching from a mythical past. The list's inclusion of kings with impossibly long reigns, some tens of thousands of years in duration, underscores its dual nature, as both a historical record and a mythological charter for kingship. It systematically chronicles the transfer of royal power from one city to another, asserting that kingship itself was a cosmic institution that descended from heaven. This concept established a powerful theological basis for a centralized monarchical state, moving power from the collective, temple-based authority of earlier periods to the person of a single ruler. This new figure, the Lugal, or Great Man, now commanded not just religious, but also military and political supremacy. Simultaneously, in the highlands to the east, the Elamites were undergoing their own process of political consolidation. The early Elamite dynasties, such as those of Awan and later Semashki, represent the culmination of this trend. Unlike the Sumerian city-state model, which saw sovereignty shift between competing urban centers, Elamite state formation appears to have been a process of confederation among diverse highland groups. This brought a previously decentralized system under the rule of a single monarch. The Elamite rulers, much like their Sumerian counterparts, were able to command resources and levy troops on a scale far beyond the local chieftaincies of the past. Historical sources, including their own royal inscriptions, confirm the existence of a succession of rulers who solidified their grip on power and centralized administrative control from their capital at Susa. The establishment of these dynastic states fundamentally altered the nature of conflict between the two civilizations. It transformed the localized skirmishes of the proto-urban era into large-scale, state-sponsored wars. No longer were clashes over trade routes or grazing lands the sole province of regional factions. Now, the full military and economic apparatus of entire kingdoms could be brought to bear. The Sumerian king list's explicit mention of rulers who struck down Elam marks the formal entry of this rivalry into the historical record, elevating it to a matter of dynastic prestige. For the first time, victory over a rival was a prerequisite for a king to claim his place in a divinely ordained historical lineage. The shift to dynastic rule also had significant long-term implications for the rivalry's narrative. For the Sumerians, The king list served as a powerful tool for cultural self-identity, a testament to their civilizational uniqueness and their divinely appointed role. For the Elamites, dynastic unification was a pragmatic response to the increasing power of the Mesopotamian plain, a necessary step to protect their resources and maintain their independence. This period, therefore, marks the end of an era of fragmented authority and the beginning of a centuries-long struggle between two organized, politically mature superpowers, each with a formalized state, a royal lineage, and a profound sense of its own historical destiny. The wars to come would be fought not by rival settlements, but by rival crowns. The foundational economic disparity between the Mesopotamian lowlands and the Elamite highlands served as a primary driver of their long-standing conflict. Sumerian civilization, despite its immense agricultural productivity, was a region profoundly poor in the raw materials essential for its technological and cultural advancement. The Mesopotamian plains provided clay for bricks and tablets, but they lacked the timber needed for monumental construction, the hard stones required for sculpture and tools, and the vital metals necessary for weaponry and implements. This scarcity created an insatiable demand for resources that were abundant in Elamite territory, forging an economic dependency that was both a source of trade and a trigger for military action. Historical records, particularly from the early dynastic period onward, document this strategic deficit. Sumerian administrative texts and temple inventories meticulously record the importation of cedar and cypress wood, valued for their durability in a climate where local date palm wood was insufficient for major projects. These same archives detail the acquisition of various types of stone, from the rare diorite favoured for royal statuary to the more common limestone and alabaster used in architecture. The most critical imports, however, were metals. Copper, and later tin, were the lifeblood of Sumerian metallurgy, and their sourcing was a matter of national security. While some of these materials could be found in more distant regions, the most direct and reliable routes passed through Elamite-controlled territory, placing a significant portion of Sumer's economic future under the influence of its eastern neighbour. This reality dictated that Sumerian foreign policy was often an extension of its economic needs. Campaigns into the highlands were not just about conquest for territory, but about securing direct access to these valuable resources. Elamite rulers, in turn, leveraged their control over trade routes and mineral deposits to exert influence over the Mesopotamian city-states. This dynamic created a system where long-distance trade was often less a free market exchange and more a form of coerced tribute or a concession extracted through military threat. The acquisition of raw materials became a point of pride and a measure of a king's power, as reflected in royal inscriptions that boast not just of conquered peoples, but of the metals and stones brought back to Uruk or Kish. Archaeological evidence corroborates the textual record. Excavations in Sumerian cities have uncovered immense quantities of imported materials, particularly in temple and palace complexes. Objects made of copper and precious metals, as well as sculptures carved from highland stones, stand as tangible proof of a massive import economy. The presence of these materials, alongside the absence of their natural sources in the Mesopotamian geological record, demonstrates the fundamental dependency that defined the Sumerian-Elamite relationship. This economic imperative transformed the geopolitical landscape. What began as a rivalry between two distinct cultures evolved into a contest for survival, with Sumer's prosperity and military strength directly tied to its ability to secure a continuous flow of resources from the resource-rich but hostile Elamite highlands. This unresolvable tension became the enduring economic foundation for centuries of conflict. The advent of formalized dynastic rule in Mesopotamia provided the context for the earliest explicit cuneiform records of interstate conflict. While previous archaeological evidence hinted at tensions, the First Dynasty of Kish offers the initial textual glimpse of a direct and documented military confrontation with Elam. This period marks a pivotal transition, where a rivalry previously understood through material culture became a matter of historical record, inscribed on stone and clay for posterity. A key figure in this era is Enmebarajesi, a king of Kish whose name is recorded in the Sumerian king list. Beyond the traditional king lists, his historical existence is corroborated by two separate contemporary inscriptions discovered at Nippur. These fragments, though brief, hold immense historical significance, as they contain the earliest non-mythological references to warfare between the two civilizations. One inscription, a stone vase fragment, bears the simple yet profound claim, Enmebarajesi, king of Kish, he plundered the land of Elam. This succinct statement is a powerful historical artifact, confirming that by the early dynastic period, military action against the Eastern Highlands was a recognized and noteworthy achievement for a Mesopotamian ruler. The nature of these earliest recorded wars, as suggested by the inscriptions, was likely one of raid and retribution rather than large-scale conquest. The term plundered, Sa, in Sumerian, implies an expedition aimed at seizing resources, captives, and valuables, not a campaign designed for permanent territorial annexation or the overthrow of an entire kingdom. Such a military undertaking from the Mesopotamian heartland to the Elamite highlands would have been a major logistical challenge, requiring a well-organized force capable of traversing significant distance. The fact that this feat was deemed worthy of monumental inscription demonstrates its strategic importance and the prestige it brought to the ruler who accomplished it. These first words of war establish a defining pattern for the centuries to come. The rivalry was not merely a series of isolated incidents, but an enduring and recognized state of affairs. The military success of a Sumerian king against Elam became a key measure of his legitimacy and power, a precedent that would be followed by later rulers in Akkad and Ur. Conversely, for the Elamites, these attacks solidified their perception of the Mesopotamian states as persistent aggressors and a continuous threat to their political autonomy. The inscriptions of Kish, therefore, serve as the formal textual beginning of the conflict narrative, a primary source that moves beyond conjecture and into the realm of explicit historical fact. They represent the moment when the geopolitical tension between the river and the mountain civilizations was first articulated in the enduring medium of cuneiform, setting the stage for all future conflicts. The reign of Enmebarajesi of Kish, already noted for its textual evidence of military action against Elam, is further illuminated by a profound piece of archaeological evidence: the construction of monumental city walls. These fortifications, which encircled the city, stand as a tangible testament to the era's deep-seated geopolitical anxieties. They represent a significant investment of labor and resources, a strategic decision that was a direct response to the perceived threat posed by neighboring powers, most notably the Elamites. The scale of these public works projects indicates that a king's power was measured not just by his ability to conquer, but by his capacity to defend. The architectural features of these walls are a reflection of a sophisticated military and administrative system. Constructed primarily from mud brick, they were built on a scale previously unseen in Mesopotamian urbanism. They would have required a centralized authority to plan the engineering, organize the production of countless bricks, and mobilize a large workforce. The very existence of such a massive defensive structure contradicts the notion of a peaceful, proto-literate society. It points to a culture that was acutely aware of external dangers and willing to commit its entire economic and social apparatus to urban defense. These walls were not just passive barriers, they were a manifestation of a martial ideology, a statement of a king's power and his commitment to protecting his people from outside aggression. Beyond their defensive function, these walls served a powerful symbolic purpose. They delineated the civilized urban space from the untamed and dangerous outside world. They represented a king's command over his city's resources and population, and his ability to establish a permanent, secure state. In the context of the rivalry with Elam, the walls of Kish were a declaration of sovereignty, a physical response to the raids and incursions that Enmebarajesi's own inscriptions claim to have punished. The fortifications demonstrate that while Sumerian kings might have plundered Elam, they also feared similar retributive actions from the highlands. The military exchange was bidirectional, and defense was as crucial to a ruler's reputation as conquest. The historical significance of these walls cannot be overstated. They provide a material counterpoint to the brief textual records of the era. While an inscription might proclaim a fleeting military victory, a wall of this scale and permanence speaks to a continuous, long-term threat. It suggests that the conflict with Elam was not an occasional event, but an enduring reality that shaped urban planning, resource allocation, and a king's strategic priorities. The reign of Enma-Baragesi, therefore, is a moment where the historical record, both textual and archaeological, converges to paint a picture of a society engaged in an intense geopolitical struggle, a struggle so profound that it led them to build on a scale that would be visible for millennia. The Wall of the Warrior King stands as a silent monument to the dawn of this ancient rivalry. The consolidation of power in Uruk during its first dynasty marks a significant evolution in Sumerian statecraft, transitioning from a system where authority shifted between city-states to one where a single urban center exerted a dominant and sustained influence. This era of unprecedented urban expansion and cultural centralization was defined not by military conquest alone, but by a powerful fusion of religious and political authority. Uruk's ascendancy was rooted in its role as a great religious center, a position that enabled its kings to mobilize resources and labor on a scale unmatched by their rivals. Archaeological evidence from Uruk reveals the immense scope of this consolidation. The city's famous Inanna precinct, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, underwent a period of monumental construction that transformed its core. The temples of this era, built on massive platforms, were not just places of worship, but served as the administrative and economic nerve centers of the city-state. They housed granaries, workshops, and bureaucratic offices, managing vast agricultural estates and orchestrating long-distance trade. The architectural scale of these buildings, far surpassing that of any previous structures, signaled a new era of centralized control. It demonstrated the king's ability to command an immense workforce, a feat that reinforced his legitimacy through public display. This centralization of power had a profound impact on the political landscape of Sumer. Unlike the fragmented authority of the early dynasties, Uruk's kings were able to project influence over a wider territory, a process that scholarly texts refer to as the Uruk expansion. While this expansion involved military action, its foundation was the establishment of a network of dependent settlements linked to Uruk's religious and economic system. By controlling the spiritual life of the region through its cult of Inanna, Uruk's rulers were able to extend their secular authority without the continuous military exertion of a conventional empire. They solidified a form of theocratic dominance, where submission to Uruk was framed as an act of piety, a service to the gods. This shift to theocratic power projection placed Uruk in a new and more challenging relationship with Elam. The Elamites had long contended with the military raids of kings like Enma-Baragesi, but Uruk's new form of dominance was more pervasive. It represented an expansion not just of a king's plundering reach, but of an entire religious and political system. Uruk's control over key trade routes and its hegemonic influence over surrounding Sumerian city-states meant that it could exert economic pressure on Elam in a way that previous fragmented dynasties could not. The construction of massive temples and the unprecedented urban scale of Uruk stood as a silent challenge to Elamite sovereignty, a powerful physical testament to a rival's growing hegemonic ambitions. This consolidation of power marked the emergence of Uruk as a major political and economic rival, setting the stage for a new phase of conflict defined by the struggle between a theocratic superpower and its eastern neighbor. The rise of Uruk's theocratic power and its expanding influence did not go unchallenged. Faced with a rival that was projecting its hegemonic will into the lowlands, the Elamites responded with their own political and military consolidation, culminating in a series of direct offensives into the Mesopotamian plain. This counteroffensive represented a strategic shift for the Elamites, moving from defending their resources to actively contesting Sumerian power in its heartland. It was a direct consequence of Uruk's ascendancy, a necessary response to the growing threat that a unified and expansive Sumer posed to Elamite sovereignty. Archaeological and textual evidence points to a period of internal strengthening within Elam. The early Elamite dynasties, with their capital at Susa, were able to unite the disparate highland groups, creating a more cohesive political entity. This unification provided the Elamite rulers with the administrative and military capacity to not only protect their mountain passes, but to project power westward. Their forces, a unique blend of disciplined Susa-based soldiers and mobile highland warriors, were a formidable combination. The Elamites' mastery of guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of the borderlands made them highly effective in launching fast, disruptive raids into the rich Sumerian territory. These incursions were not random acts of piracy. They were part of a deliberate military strategy to destabilize Uruk's burgeoning sphere of influence and disrupt its economic networks. The targets of these counteroffensives were often Sumerian city-states or their allies in the eastern and central parts of the plain. The raids focused on seizing agricultural wealth, livestock and captives which were brought back to Elam. These expeditions served a dual purpose. They enriched the Elamite kingdom and, more importantly, demonstrated to the Sumerian cities that Uruk's self-proclaimed protection was not absolute. By striking at Uruk's allies, the Elamites sought to undermine the theocratic power that framed submission to Uruk as a guarantee of security. They presented themselves as a viable and powerful alternative, a force that could challenge the authority of the great Sumerian city. This period of Elamite military action is attested to in the records of the Mesopotamian states themselves. While Elamite sources from this early era are scarce, Sumerian texts, including administrative accounts and later royal inscriptions, refer to these raids and to the need to defend against them. The repeated nature of these military engagements suggests that the Elamite threat was a persistent reality for the Sumerians, forcing them to divert resources to defense and border patrol. The Elamite counteroffensive marked a new phase in the rivalry, transforming it from an economic and cultural contest into a direct military confrontation. It set a precedent for centuries to come, establishing that the Elamites, despite their decentralized nature, were a military power capable of challenging the greatest of the Mesopotamian dynasties on their own terms. The long-standing rivalry between Sumer and Elam was not confined to grand sieges and dynastic battles for political supremacy. A more fundamental and persistent form of conflict unfolded on the vast semi-arid steppe that lay between the two civilizations' core territories. This region, known as the buffer zone, was the site of a continuous struggle for control over vital grazing lands and trade routes, a conflict that pitted Elamite nomadic tribes against the interests of Sumerian city-states. The steppe was a crucial economic asset for both sides. For the Elamites, particularly the mobile highland groups, it provided essential pasture for their herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. The seasonal movements of these pastoralist communities were dictated by the availability of forage, and access to the rich grasslands of the interregional zone was a matter of survival. Their economy was based on the output of these herds, from wool and leather to dairy products and meat. For the Sumerians, the steppe served a different purpose. While their economy was based on intensive, irrigated agriculture, they depended on these lands for their own livestock and, critically, for the trade routes that crisscrossed the territory. The passage of goods from the east, including precious metals and stones from the Iranian plateau, relied on secure and predictable routes through this region. The clash of these two economic systems on the steppe was inevitable. As Sumerian cities expanded, they sought to extend their authority and security over the trade arteries. They established fortified outposts and maintained military patrols to protect caravans and assert their claims. Elamite tribes, meanwhile, viewed any such incursions as a direct threat to their traditional grazing grounds and a violation of their autonomy. Their response was direct and often brutal. Raids on Sumerian outposts and attacks on caravans were common, as were clashes with Sumerian shepherds who brought their own herds to the disputed grasslands. These were not the orchestrated campaigns of kings, but a decentralized, low-intensity conflict waged by herders and warriors defending their livelihoods. These localized skirmishes had far-reaching consequences. For the Sumerians, a disruption on the steppe could paralyze a city's economy, as the flow of essential raw materials was choked off. This vulnerability often compelled kings to launch larger, more formal military expeditions to pacify the region, bringing the rivalry from the periphery to the center of dynastic politics. For the Elamites, success on the steppe was a direct measure of their autonomy from Sumerian hegemonic pressure. Their mastery of this environment gave them leverage in diplomatic negotiations and allowed them to extract tribute in exchange for safe passage. The struggle for the steppe, therefore, was a microcosm of the larger geopolitical rivalry. It was an enduring, asymmetrical conflict that shaped the daily lives of those living on the margins of both civilizations. It demonstrated that even without a formal declaration of war, the two powers were in a constant state of competition, their economic and military interests colliding over every patch of fertile land and every winding trade path. It was a war of attrition waged over centuries, fought not with great armies, but with shepherds' staves and the swords of nomads. The relationship between Elam and Mesopotamia was not defined solely by conflict. The early history of their interaction also includes the first known peace treaty in human history, an elusive but profoundly significant cuneiform document that provides a rare glimpse into ancient diplomacy. This treaty, known as the Elamite-Akkadian Treaty, dates to the late 3rd millennium BCE and represents a formal attempt to resolve the deep-seated tensions that had fueled centuries of rivalry. Its existence confirms that even in a world of constant military contention, both sides sought to manage their relationship through legal and diplomatic means, acknowledging a need for a formal mechanism to prevent perpetual war. The treaty itself is known to us through a fragmented cuneiform tablet discovered at the Elamite capital of Susa. Written in both Akkadian and Elamite, the document's bilingual nature underscores its purpose as a mutual agreement between two distinct political entities. The text outlines a series of terms, including agreements on trade relations, the repatriation of prisoners, and a commitment to cease military hostilities. It represents a groundbreaking moment in human legal history, as it moves beyond simple truce agreements to establish a formal framework for peaceful coexistence. The treaty's provisions were meticulously detailed, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of international law and the complexities of managing a relationship between two rival superpowers. However, the treaty's historical significance lies not in its success, but in its ultimate failure. While it was a groundbreaking diplomatic effort, it proved unable to resolve the fundamental economic and political conflicts that lay at the heart of the rivalry. The document was a product of the Akkadian Empire's desire for stability on its eastern frontier, a need driven by the immense military and logistical strain of constantly policing its borders. For the Elamites, entering into the treaty may have been a tactical decision, a way to gain a period of respite and rebuild their strength for a later confrontation. It was a formal agreement, but it lacked the political will and the shared trust necessary to make it an enduring solution. The treaty's failure is reflected in the historical record that followed its signing. The period of peace it inaugurated was short-lived, with renewed hostilities breaking out shortly after its conclusion. The deep-seated tensions over trade routes, resource control, and hegemonic influence could not be solved with a piece of paper alone. The treaty stands as a powerful testament to the limits of diplomacy in a world where fundamental geopolitical interests are in opposition. It demonstrates that while both sides understood the need for peace, they were unwilling or unable to address the core issues that made conflict an inevitable part of their long-standing relationship. The first peace treaty in history, therefore, is a story of a missed opportunity, a temporary pause in a centuries-long conflict that would ultimately be resolved not through negotiation, but through the overwhelming force of military might. The rise of Sargon of Akkad marks a revolutionary turning point in the history of the ancient Near East, and, by extension, in the long-standing rivalry between Sumer and Elam. Sargon's ambition was unprecedented. He sought to move beyond the traditional city-state model to create a unified multi-regional empire. This new imperial project fundamentally altered the nature of conflict with Elam. Where previous Sumerian kings had launched punitive raids for plunder and prestige, Sargon's military focus was on total conquest and the permanent subjugation of his eastern rival. Sargon's campaigns against the Elamite highlands are well documented in his own royal inscriptions and later historical sources. His army, a formidable and disciplined force that transcended the old city-state allegiances, was designed for sustained military operations rather than short-term raids. The Akkadian military machine was characterized by its professional standing army, superior weaponry, and a logistical system capable of supporting campaigns far from the Mesopotamian heartland. Sargon used this force to great effect, targeting not just the borderlands but the very core of Elamite power. His strategy was comprehensive, aimed at neutralizing Elamite military capacity and dismantling their political structures. The key to Sargon's success lay in his ability to divide and conquer. Historical texts reveal that he exploited internal divisions within the Elamite Confederacy, allying with local rulers who resented the central authority of the Awan dynasty. His military operations were not a single sweeping campaign, but a series of systematic attacks against Elamite city-states and their allies. Akkadian inscriptions proudly proclaim Sargon's triumphs, mentioning the names of conquered Elamite kings and the destruction of their fortresses. These records detail how Sargon captured their capitals, seized immense quantities of tribute, and installed Akkadian governors to maintain direct imperial control. This direct rule was a novel concept in the rivalry, a radical departure from the fleeting dominance of earlier Sumerian kings. The Akkadian conquest, while devastating, was not a final solution to the Elamite problem. Sargon and his successors, including his grandson Naram-Sin, were forced into a perpetual cycle of reconquest. The Elamites, with their decentralized power structure and their mastery of the mountainous terrain, proved to be an exceptionally resilient opponent. Their decentralized nature meant that even when a central capital was taken, rebellious highland clans could continue to wage a campaign of attrition. This resistance drained Akkadian resources and stretched the empire's military to its breaking point. Sargon's campaigns, therefore, transformed the rivalry from a regional conflict into a persistent and costly imperial enterprise, one that ultimately contributed to the overextension and eventual collapse of the Akkadian Empire itself. The Akkadian thunderbolt may have temporarily subdued the eastern rival, but it failed to extinguish its independent spirit, setting the stage for future resurgences. The reign of Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, marks the apex of the Akkadian Empire's power and its most aggressive phase of expansion. His title, King of the Four Quarters, was not a mere boast. It was a formal declaration of his claim to universal dominion, a concept that placed him in direct ideological conflict with every other sovereign state, including Elam. Naram-Sin's campaigns against the eastern rival were meticulously recorded on monumental steles and in royal inscriptions, providing both a historical and a highly stylized account of the temporary subjugation of Elamite power. The most famous of these documents is the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, a masterpiece of ancient Mesopotamian art and political propaganda. While the stele primarily celebrates a military triumph over the Lulubi people, its broader message is one of total and overwhelming imperial power. The artistic depiction of Naram-Sin, a larger-than-life figure trampling his enemies, is a visual manifestation of his self-proclaimed divine status. Historical texts, including inscriptions from his reign, provide a more detailed account of his military actions against Elam. These records indicate that Naram-Sin led a series of campaigns that were a continuation of Sargon's strategy of total conquest. He targeted not just the major Elamite cities, but also the mountain strongholds of the highlands, demonstrating a systematic approach to dismantling Elamite resistance. Naram-Sin's inscriptions explicitly name the Elamite rulers he defeated, a practice that adds a layer of historical specificity to his triumphs. One such record mentions the defeat of the Elamite king of the Awan dynasty, a victory that effectively broke the centralized authority that had led Elamite military resistance. The inscriptions detail the immense spoils of war brought back to Akkad, including captured armies, precious metals, and cultic objects, which were dedicated to the gods as a testament to Naram-Sin's divinely sanctioned power. This ritualized seizure of an enemy's gods was a profound act of spiritual and political subjugation, designed to demonstrate the overwhelming superiority of the Akkadian pantheon and its emperor. However, the historical context of Naram-Sin's triumphs reveals their impermanence. The military subjugation of Elam, while celebrated as a decisive victory, was a costly and resource-intensive endeavor. Akkadian control over the highlands was tenuous and required a continuous military presence to enforce. The Elamites, with their decentralized power structure and their mastery of the mountainous terrain, proved to be an exceptionally resilient opponent. Their continuous resistance, even after their leaders were defeated and their cities were sacked, drained Akkadian resources and stretched the empire's military to its breaking point. Naram-Sin's campaigns, therefore, transformed the rivalry from a regional conflict into a persistent and costly imperial enterprise, one that ultimately contributed to the overextension and eventual collapse of the Akkadian Empire. The king who commanded the four quarters may have temporarily subdued his eastern rival, but his triumph was a fleeting one. The Akkadian Empire's military subjugation of the Elamite highlands, while celebrated in royal inscriptions, did not result in a lasting peace. Instead, it inaugurated a period of continuous and relentless rebellion, a persistent campaign of resistance that would plague the Akkadian state for generations. The nature of Elamite society, a confederation of independent cities and mountain clans, made total conquest virtually impossible. Even when a central ruler was defeated and a capital was sacked, the decentralized power structure meant that pockets of resistance would remain, ready to rise up at the first sign of imperial weakness. This forced the Akkadian emperors to engage in a costly and unending series of punitive expeditions that ultimately drained their resources and contributed to the empire's overextension. Historical records from the reigns of Sargon, Ramush, Manishtushu, and Naram-Sin all contain references to Elamite revolts. Administrative tablets detail the logistical burdens of these campaigns, from the conscription of troops to the immense resources required for their supply. The military expeditions were not brief affairs. They were long, arduous undertakings through hostile terrain, designed to punish rebellious cities and re-establish imperial authority. Akkadian inscriptions recount how their armies systematically destroyed settlements, seized grain stores, and took captives. However, these brutal displays of force proved to be a temporary solution, as the population's will to resist remained unbroken. The Elamite revolts were often triggered by succession crises in Akkad, or when imperial attention was focused on other fronts, such as in Syria or Anatolia. Elamite rulers, with their sophisticated intelligence networks, were quick to exploit these moments of imperial distraction. The rebellions were well coordinated, often involving multiple Elamite cities and their allies, and they presented a united front against Akkadian rule. This required the Akkadian emperors to divert significant military resources from other parts of the empire, weakening their control elsewhere, and creating a geopolitical domino effect that fueled further instability. This continuous cycle of rebellion and reconquest transformed the nature of the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry from a series of intermittent wars into a perpetual state of imperial occupation and resistance. For the Akkadians, maintaining control over Elam became a persistent drain on their economy and military manpower, a problem that grew more severe with each generation. For the Elamites, the rebellions were a testament to their national identity and their refusal to be absorbed into a foreign empire. Their decentralized and resilient nature proved to be a more powerful weapon against a vast centralized empire than any single army could be. The Elamite rebellions, therefore, were not just a series of military events, but a continuous struggle that shaped the final years of the Akkadian Empire, demonstrating that a rival's will to resist could be a more formidable force than any imperial army. The reign of Naram-Sin of Akkad reached its dramatic peak not only in military conquest, but also in its monumental artistic expression. The Victory Stele of Naram-Sin is a prime example of this, a work that serves as both a historical record and a powerful piece of political propaganda. While the stele's most famous scene depicts Naram-Sin's triumph over the Lulubi mountain tribes, its broader message of overwhelming imperial power and divinely sanctioned vengeance is also directed at the Elamites, who were his most persistent and formidable rivals. The stele, and other similar sculptures and inscriptions, provides a visual and textual account of the final years of the Awan dynasty, a brief period of imperial glory that immediately preceded the Akkadian Empire's decline. The stele's artistic composition is a deliberate and radical departure from previous Sumerian art. Earlier victory steles, such as that of Eonatum of Lagash, depicted military triumph in a series of horizontal registers, showing a narrative of events. In contrast, Naram-Sin's stele employs a single dynamic scene, with the emperor positioned at the very apex of the composition, ascending a mountain. His helmet is adorned with horns, a symbol of divinity, placing him on a level with the gods themselves. This artistic choice reflects a profound shift in political ideology. Naram-Sin was the first Mesopotamian king to formally claim divine status during his lifetime. This claim to divine sanction was directly tied to his military successes, particularly over a rival as ancient and powerful as Elam. Historical inscriptions from Naram-Sin's reign provide the textual context for this artistic depiction. These texts, found on various artifacts and clay cones, document his military campaigns against the Elamite highlands with specificity. They record the defeat of the last king of the Awan dynasty and the sacking of Elamite cities. The inscriptions detail the seizure of immense tribute, including precious metals and slaves, and the ceremonial capture of the cultic objects of the defeated Elamite gods. This act of spiritual subjugation was a powerful statement of imperial might, intended to demonstrate the overwhelming superiority of the Akkadian pantheon and its earthly representative. The stele itself, originally erected in Sippar, was later taken as a trophy by a victorious Elamite king centuries later, an act of historical irony that underscores the cyclical nature of their rivalry. The sculptures of vengeance, therefore, serve as a powerful testament to the intensity of this ancient conflict. They are not merely static pieces of art. They are a manifestation of a sophisticated political and military strategy. They were designed to communicate a message of absolute, divinely sanctioned authority over a defeated rival. However, the temporary nature of this triumph is the key to understanding its place in history. While Naram-Sin's victory over the Awan dynasty was complete, the decentralized and resilient nature of the Elamite people meant that his empire would soon be plagued by the very rebellions that contributed to its collapse. The stele of Naram-Sin stands as a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of an empire at its zenith, just before its precipitous decline. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire, hastened by internal rebellions and economic overextension, did not bring peace to the ancient Near East. Instead, it ushered in a period of chaos known as the Gutian Interregnum. This era, spanning roughly a century, saw the invasion and temporary dominance of the Gutian peoples, a nomadic group originating from the Zagros Mountains. Their arrival fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape, leaving both the Sumerians and the Elamites vulnerable to a new and shared enemy, and forcing a temporary suspension of their ancient rivalry in the face of a common threat. The Gutian invasion was not a sophisticated campaign of conquest, but a more chaotic and disruptive occupation. Historical texts from the period, particularly the Sumerian king list, describe the Gutians as a kingless horde who plunged the land into anarchy. They were not urban builders or administrators like their predecessors. Their rule was characterized by disruption, raids, and a general collapse of the established administrative order. Their control over Mesopotamia was tenuous, exercised primarily through a series of military garrisons and tribute collection, rather than through systematic governance. This lack of centralized rule led to the fragmentation of the Mesopotamian plain into a patchwork of independent city-states, each struggling for survival in the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. For the Sumerians, the Gutian occupation was a period of profound suffering. The disruption of trade routes and the collapse of the irrigation infrastructure led to widespread famine and economic hardship. Historical texts lament the curse of the Gutians, describing them as a destructive force that brought darkness to the land. However, this period of fragmentation also allowed for a reassertion of local Sumerian power. While the Gutians controlled the major urban centers, they lacked the will or the capacity to suppress the emerging independent city-states, such as Lagash and Uruk. This gave local rulers an opportunity to rebuild their institutions and military strength in preparation for a later rebellion. The Elamites too were affected by the Gutian presence. Although their homeland in the highlands was not directly occupied in the same manner as the Mesopotamian plain, the Gutian control of the Zagros passes and the disruption of trade routes created significant economic and political instability. For a time, the Elamites were forced to contend with their own new, aggressive neighbors from the mountains. This shared external threat, while not creating a formal alliance, effectively put a pause on the long-standing Sumerian-Elamite rivalry. Both civilizations were too preoccupied with their own internal struggles and the immediate threat of the Gutians to engage in full-scale war with each other. The Gutian interregnum, therefore, was a period of geopolitical chaos that reset the power balance in the ancient Near East. It was an era of fragmentation that brought both Sumerian and Elamite civilization to their knees, but it also inadvertently provided them with the opportunity to recover. The ultimate legacy of the Gutian period was the catalyst it provided for a new wave of political consolidation. The memory of foreign rule, combined with a desire to restore a classical age of order, spurred a resurgence of Sumerian power and a renewed determination in Elam to secure its independence, setting the stage for the next and most devastating phase of their ancient conflict. The chaotic period of Gutian occupation, which brought a temporary pause to the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry, provided a critical window of opportunity for the Elamites to reassert their independence and forge a more powerful state. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire had left a power vacuum in the region, and the Gutian rule, characterized by its lack of centralized administration, allowed for the re-emergence of local authority in both Sumer and Elam. It was during this era that the Samashki dynasty rose to prominence in Elam, a line of rulers who would consolidate power and begin preparing for a final reckoning with their ancient rivals in Mesopotamia. The rise of the Samashki dynasty was not a sudden event, but a gradual process of political unification. Elamite rulers, operating from their capital in Susa and a series of powerful mountain fortresses, were able to bring the disparate highland clans and urban centers under a single cohesive authority. This consolidation was driven by a dual purpose: to expel the disruptive Gutian influence from their territory and to prepare a unified front against the inevitable reassertion of Sumerian power. Unlike the decentralized confederacies of the past, the Samashki state was more centralized and militarily organized, a direct response to the threats posed by both the Gutians and the future hegemons of the Mesopotamian plain. Historical evidence for this period comes from a combination of Elamite royal inscriptions and later Mesopotamian chronicles. Elamite texts from the Samashki period boast of their rulers' military victories and their success in uniting the various regions of Elam. These inscriptions are a clear statement of a new and confident Elamite identity, one that had moved beyond mere resistance to a foreign power and was now focused on projecting its own military and political authority. The Samashki kings, with their newfound strength, were not content to simply secure their borders. They began to assert their influence over the trade routes and the buffer zones that lay between their highlands and the Sumerian lowlands, a clear sign of their hegemonic ambitions. This re-emergence of a unified and militarily potent Elamite state was a direct challenge to the Sumerians, who were themselves beginning to consolidate power under the third dynasty of Ur. The memory of the Akkadian Empire's attempts at conquest, and the humiliation of the Gutian interregnum had fostered a sense of national purpose in both civilizations. For the Elamites, the Samashki dynasty was the culmination of their long struggle for independence, a chance to not only defend their sovereignty, but to finally establish their own dominance. For the Sumerians, the re-emergence of a powerful Elamite kingdom was a sign that their rival was once again a major threat, one that needed to be contained before their new empire could be fully established. The stage was set for the final and most devastating act of their ancient conflict, a war that would determine the ultimate fate of both civilizations. The political vacuum left by the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the subsequent Gutian chaos provided a fertile ground for a new Sumerian revival. From the city-state of a new power emerged in the form of Ur-Nammu, a king who would not only drive out the Gutians, but also establish the third dynasty of a period that would become known as the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance. Ur-Nammu's ambition was to restore the glory of the past, to rebuild the great urban centers, and to reassert Sumerian cultural and political supremacy over the entire Mesopotamian plain. This monumental project, fueled by a desire for vengeance against the foreign invaders and a vision of a unified Sumerian state, brought him into direct and renewed conflict with his most ancient rival, the ascendant Elamite kingdom of the Samashki dynasty. Ur-Nammu's rise was a deliberate and strategic process of consolidation. He first established his authority over then systematically brought other Sumerian city-states under his control through a combination of military force and diplomatic alliance. His administration was characterized by a meticulous attention to detail, as evidenced by his famous law code, which predates Hammurabi's and outlines a comprehensive system of laws and justice. This emphasis on centralized administration and legal order was a direct response to the chaos of the Gutian period. Ur-Nammu's ultimate goal was to create a stable, unified state with a powerful military and a centralized bureaucracy that could not only defend against future invasions, but also project its power beyond its borders. This vision of a renewed Sumerian empire naturally brought him into opposition with the Elamites. The Samashki dynasty, which had spent the same period of Gutian chaos consolidating its own power, viewed Ur-Nammu's expansion as a direct threat to its hegemonic ambitions. For Ur-Nammu, the Elamites were not just a rival but a symbol of the foreign humiliation his people had suffered. The memory of the Gutian invasion and the previous Akkadian defeats served as a powerful motivator. He saw the Elamites, with their unified state and their control over the eastern trade routes, as an obstacle that had to be overcome to secure Sumer's future prosperity and political dominance. The conflict that ensued was a contest between two well-organized, militarily potent states. Ur-Nammu's campaigns against Elam were not the hit-and-run raids of earlier dynasties, but well-planned military operations aimed at gaining control of strategic territory and disrupting Elamite trade. While the textual records of this early period are fragmented, they indicate a series of military confrontations that defined the first years of the Ur-III dynasty. These conflicts were a prelude to the larger wars that would engulf the region, as both sides, now organized under powerful, centralized monarchies, prepared for a final and decisive showdown. The rise of Ur-Nammu and his ambition to restore Sumerian glory fundamentally transformed the nature of the rivalry, setting the stage for a period of all-out war. The third dynasty of under the visionary leadership of Ur-Nammu and his successors, developed a military and logistical apparatus that was a marvel of ancient engineering and administration. This Ur-III war machine was a direct product of their ambition to restore Sumerian supremacy and to wage a new kind of conflict against the Elamites. Unlike the ad hoc forces of earlier city-states, the military of Ur-III was a professional, standing army, meticulously organized and supported by an administrative system of unprecedented scale and efficiency. The professional nature of the army was a key innovation. Soldiers were not part-time farmers or craftsmen, but were full-time state employees, trained and equipped for sustained military operations. The army was divided into distinct units, including infantry and archers, and its officers were part of a disciplined military hierarchy. This professionalism allowed for a level of tactical sophistication and unit cohesion that was unmatched by the more loosely organized forces of their rivals. It enabled the kings of Ur to launch well-planned, long-distance campaigns into the Elamite highlands, a feat that required superior training and discipline to navigate the difficult terrain and engage a formidable enemy on its own ground. The logistical system that supported this army was the true genius of the Ur-3 state. Administrative tablets from the period, many of which have been recovered by modern archaeologists, provide a wealth of information about this immense bureaucratic effort. The texts detail the state's management of every aspect of a military campaign, from the procurement of rations and water to the production and transport of weaponry. The bureaucracy was capable of tracking thousands of soldiers and their supplies over hundreds of miles, a logistical feat that was a direct result of their centralized and meticulously organized administration. This system was not a temporary response to a crisis, but a permanent feature of the Ur-3 state, a testament to their long-term strategic vision for a unified and militarily dominant Sumer. Beyond their professional army and its logistical support, the Ur-3 military was also at the forefront of siege technology. Their campaigns against the fortified cities of Elam required them to develop and deploy advanced methods for breaching city walls. While direct textual evidence of siege engines is scarce, the archaeological record of a number of breached and conquered Elamite cities suggests a mastery of siegecraft. These military innovations, combined with their superior organization, gave the Ur-3 army a distinct advantage in their conflict with the Elamites, allowing them to systematically reduce their enemies' strongholds and project power in a way that previous Sumerian dynasties could not. The Ur-3 war machine, therefore, was not merely a military force. It was a reflection of a powerful, centralized state at its zenith. It was an army fueled by a sophisticated bureaucracy and armed with advanced technology, all in the service of a grand imperial project. This war machine, built for a final, decisive war, would set the stage for the climactic final conflict with the Elamites. The military prowess of the third dynasty of Ur was not confined to offensive campaigns. A profound and telling symbol of the era's geopolitical anxiety was the construction of a massive defensive structure known as the Wall of the West. This monumental feat of engineering, undertaken by the kings of Ur, was a direct and strategic response to the existential threats that plagued the empire's borders. While its primary purpose was to defend against the incursions of the nomadic Amorite tribes from the northwest, its very existence also served as a stark physical manifestation of the deep-seated fear of external aggression, a fear born from the long history of conflict with the Elamites. This Great Wall was a linear earthwork that stretched for over 100 miles, from the Euphrates River to the Tigris River. It was not a single continuous stone wall like its later counterparts, but a series of fortified outposts, watchtowers, and moats connected by a massive embankment. The construction of this immense defensive system required an unprecedented mobilization of labor and resources, a testament to the centralized and meticulously organized administration of the Ur-3 state. The project was a strategic imperative, designed to protect the agricultural heartland of the empire from the incursions of mobile, foreign groups who had no respect for urban borders or state sovereignty. The historical context of the wall's construction is critical to understanding its significance. It was built during a period of relative peace on the Eastern Front, after the Ur-3 military had asserted its dominance over the Elamites. However, the memory of the Akkadian Empire's collapse at the hands of the Gutians and the ongoing skirmishes with various nomadic tribes fueled a pervasive sense of insecurity. The kings of Ur understood that military dominance was not a permanent state, and that a new, different kind of threat was always on the horizon. The wall, therefore, was a proactive measure, a grand-scale effort to secure the empire's future against a world of unpredictable enemies. While the wall's primary target was the Amorite tribes, it also served a secondary symbolic purpose in the rivalry with Elam. The Elamites were a known quantity, a formidable but ultimately contained threat. The Amorites, however, represented an alien force, a chaotic, unorganized power that defied the very principles of urban civilization. By building a massive defensive structure, the kings of were signaling their mastery over their own territory and their determination to control the flow of all foreign peoples, whether they were nomadic raiders or organized armies from the east. The wall was a grand physical statement of a new imperial ideology that sought to delineate and protect its borders against all foreign threats. It symbolized the new Ur-3 state's understanding of its place in the world, a beacon of order and civilization in a sea of chaos and unpredictable external forces. The Wall of Vengeance, therefore, was not just a military project, but a political and psychological one, a monument to a civilization's fear and a testament to its resolve. The ambition to restore Sumerian power and the long-standing rivalry with Elam reached a fever pitch during the reign of King Shusin. As a successor to Ur-Nammu, he inherited the immense military and administrative apparatus of the Ur-3 state, and he used it to wage a series of aggressive campaigns against Elam that represented the peak of the dynasty's military power. His efforts were not just about securing borders, they were a final, decisive attempt to establish Sumerian dominance and to settle the ancient rivalry once and for all. This period is well documented in royal hymns and inscriptions that celebrate his triumphs, portraying him as a divinely sanctioned conqueror destined to rule over all rivals. Shusin's campaigns against Elam were systematic and far-reaching. Historical records, including administrative documents and royal correspondence, detail the logistical sophistication of his military operations. His armies were able to penetrate deep into Elamite territory, targeting not just the traditional power centers like Susa, but also the fortresses and cities of the highlands. These were not mere raids, they were large-scale, coordinated military endeavors aimed at dismantling the Elamite state's military capacity and its economic networks. Inscriptions from his reign boast of Shusin's victories, naming the Elamite rulers he defeated and the immense quantities of tribute brought back to Sumer. He is lauded as a king who laid waste to the land of Elam and smashed its head. These military successes were meticulously recorded and celebrated as a new era of Sumerian supremacy. Hymns dedicated to Shusin portray him as a king of the four quarters, a title that had been used by the great Akkadian emperors and now symbolized his claim to universal dominion. These texts are a powerful form of political propaganda, meant to be read aloud and heard throughout the empire, cementing his reputation as a divinely sanctioned conqueror. They served to legitimize his rule by framing his military victories as a fulfillment of a cosmic plan, a righteous punishment against a long-standing rival. The defeat of Elam was presented not just as a political triumph, but as a spiritual one, a victory that foretold a future where Sumerian power would be unchallenged. However, the historical reality of these campaigns was more complex. While Shusin's military operations were a stunning success in the short term, they failed to permanently crush the Elamite will to resist. The decentralized nature of Elamite society meant that even with their main army defeated, a low-intensity rebellion would continue from the more remote highland clans. Shusin's campaigns, therefore, were a temporary solution to a long-term problem. The immense resources and manpower poured into these wars stretched the Ur-3 state to its limits, leaving it vulnerable to new threats. The victories of Shusin, while celebrated in hymns and royal inscriptions, were the final brilliant flash of a dynasty that was already overextended and on the brink of collapse. The campaigns, intended to secure a permanent peace through conquest, ironically set the stage for a final and devastating Elamite victory. The collapse of the Third Dynasty of far from being a simple military defeat, was a cataclysmic event that was understood by the Sumerians in deeply religious and cultural terms. This understanding is best preserved in a unique genre of cuneiform literature known as the city laments, the most famous of which is the Lament for These poetic compositions were not just chronicles of historical events, they were theological explanations for the fall of an empire, framing the coming disaster not as a failure of military strategy, but as an act of divine displeasure and cosmic retribution. They foretold the impending doom, revealing a society wrestling with the concept of a curse that had been placed upon them. The laments were meticulously crafted by temple scribes and poets, serving as a powerful form of public discourse. They describe the final years of the Ur-3 state, focusing on a series of ominous signs and portents that foreshadowed the eventual downfall. These compositions detail how the gods, angry at the hubris of the kings and the moral failings of the populace, began to abandon the city. They speak of the emptying of the temples, the silence of the divine statues, and the withdrawal of divine favor. This narrative of divine abandonment was a way for the Sumerians to make sense of their overwhelming defeat at the hands of their ancient rivals. The Elamites, in this context, were not viewed as a superior military force, but as instruments of divine will, a tool of a higher power's judgment. The lament for Ur specifically details the devastation of the city, but it attributes the destruction to an unseen force. It describes the wind and the storm that brought the city to its knees, a metaphorical and theological representation of a cosmic storm of divine wrath. The text recounts the destruction of the great temples, the defilement of the sacred precincts, and the exile of the population. The emphasis is not on the brutality of the Elamite soldiers, but on the profound sadness of a people whose gods have turned their backs on them. It is a story of a civilization in mourning, struggling to understand how a divinely sanctioned empire could be brought to ruin. These laments served a crucial cultural function. By providing a theological explanation for the defeat, they helped the Sumerian people process their collective trauma. They transformed a humiliating military loss into a profound spiritual lesson. They also served to reinforce the idea of a cyclical history, a belief that a period of foreign rule and divine punishment would eventually be followed by a period of restoration and divine favor. The curse of the defeated was thus not an end but a spiritual test, a trial that would have to be endured before a new golden age could begin. This genre of literature, therefore, stands as a testament to the intellectual and spiritual sophistication of the Sumerians, who in their darkest hour turned to poetry and theology to make sense of the chaos and to preserve a memory of their former glory. The long-standing rivalry between Sumer and Elam reached its tragic and definitive climax with the sack of the city of Ur. This was not a singular event, but the culmination of a military and political collapse that brought an end to the last great Sumerian dynasty. The invasion was a coordinated effort by two foreign powers, the Elamites, who harbored centuries of resentment, and their allies, the nomadic Amorite tribes from the west. This alliance of ancient rivals and a new external force overwhelmed the overextended and internally weakened Ur-3 state, resulting in a cataclysm of profound cultural and political consequences. The fall of Ur was preceded by a period of internal decay within the empire. The immense administrative apparatus, once a source of strength, had become a burdensome bureaucracy that was difficult to manage. The centralized control over the economy was faltering, and food shortages, exacerbated by a shift in the course of the Euphrates River, created widespread social unrest. Military pressure from the Amorites on the western frontier required a constant diversion of troops, leaving the eastern front vulnerable to a unified Elamite offensive. This internal weakness provided the perfect opportunity for the Elamite king Kindatu of the Samashki dynasty to launch a decisive attack. The Elamite and Amorite invasion was a masterclass in ancient military strategy. The Elamite army, a professional force from the highlands, moved swiftly and methodically, bypassing the heavily fortified Ur-3 cities and striking directly at the empire's heartland. The Amorites, with their superior mobility and knowledge of the terrain, were able to raid deep into Sumerian territory, disrupting supply lines and creating a state of chaos. The combination of these two forces proved unstoppable. The Elamites engaged the main Sumerian army in a series of pitched battles, while the Amorites conducted a campaign of attrition that prevented the Sumerians from regrouping or effectively responding to the main threat. The siege of Ur itself was a short but brutal affair. With the surrounding countryside already plundered and the city's defenses weakened by years of neglect and lack of resources, the Elamite forces were able to breach the city walls. What followed was a systematic destruction of the city's key institutions. The great temples and ziggurat, symbols of Sumerian power and divine favor, were razed. The royal palace, the center of the empire's administration, was plundered and burned. Historical records and archaeological evidence corroborate the scale of the devastation. Tablets speak of the city's burning and the slaughter of its inhabitants. The Elamites seized immense quantities of tribute, including the very statues of the Sumerian gods, a powerful act of spiritual and political humiliation. The sack of Ur was more than a military victory for the Elamites. It was the end of a civilization. The third dynasty of Ur, the last great Sumerian kingdom, collapsed entirely. The political fragmentation that followed saw Sumerian power disintegrate into a series of warring city-states, none of which would ever again command the hegemonic authority of the Ur-3 kings. For the Elamites, this was the ultimate victory, the culmination of a centuries-long rivalry. They had not just defeated their ancient rival, they had brought their empire to ruin. The sack of Ur and the subsequent collapse of the Ur-3 empire were understood by the Sumerians not merely as a military defeat, but as a profound theological event. This interpretation is a cornerstone of their literary and religious tradition, which framed the Elamite invasion as an act of divine judgment. For a people who believed their kings ruled by divine mandate, and that their cities were under the direct patronage of the gods, the destruction of their great capital could only be explained as the result of a cosmic punishment. The fall of Ur was therefore a reflection of the gods' will, a direct and devastating consequence of Sumerian hubris and a host of perceived transgressions. This theological explanation is meticulously detailed in the Lament for Ur, a text that provides a comprehensive religious framework for the city's demise. The Lamentations portray the gods, particularly the chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon, as abandoning their city and its people. The texts speak of the divine decision to bring a storm upon the land, a metaphorical representation of a cosmic force that was more powerful and destructive than any human army. The Elamites and Amorites, in this context, were seen not as a superior military force, but as instruments of this divine wrath, the agents of a cosmic retribution that was preordained and unstoppable. Their military victory was a function of the gods' withdrawal of favor. The lament provides specific reasons for this divine displeasure. It alludes to a period of moral decay and a breakdown in the proper relationship between humanity and the divine. The king, who was supposed to be a righteous steward, had become preoccupied with worldly matters, and the people had become complacent. The sacred rituals, which were essential for maintaining the cosmic order, were neglected, and the proper offerings were not made. This hubris, a term that in this context refers to a failure of piety and an overconfidence in human capabilities, angered the gods. The vengeance of the gods was therefore a corrective measure, a harsh but necessary act to restore the proper hierarchical order between the divine and the mortal realms. Furthermore, the theological explanation of the sack had a profound cultural purpose. By attributing the defeat to divine will, the Sumerians were able to preserve a sense of their own cultural and spiritual superiority. The defeat was not a sign of their inherent weakness, but a test of their faith. This narrative provided a source of comfort and continuity in a time of immense trauma. It allowed them to transform a humiliating military loss into a profound spiritual lesson. It also served as a warning to future generations about the dangers of abandoning piety and the importance of maintaining a proper relationship with the gods. The theological explanation of the sack of Ur therefore stands as a powerful testament to the intellectual and religious sophistication of the Sumerians, who, in their darkest hour, turned to their gods for both an explanation and a hope for future redemption. The sack of Ur marked a radical and unprecedented shift in the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East. For the first time in recorded history, the Elamites, who had for centuries been the perpetual rivals and adversaries of the Mesopotamian powers, stood as the unchallenged hegemonic force in the region. The collapse of the Ur-3 empire left a power vacuum that the Elamites were uniquely positioned to fill. Their victory was not a temporary military triumph, but a sustained occupation that placed them in a position of authority over the lands of their ancient rivals, reversing a centuries-long power dynamic. The period immediately following the sack saw a systematic consolidation of Elamite power over Mesopotamia. Elamite military garrisons were established in key urban centers, from the northern parts of the plain down to the ruins of Ur in the south. These forces were not simply there to plunder. They were a professional army of occupation, tasked with maintaining order and enforcing Elamite rule. Historical records, including administrative texts and later chronicles, confirm that Elamite officials and administrators were installed in positions of power, collecting tribute and managing local affairs. This was a direct and overt exercise of sovereignty, a definitive statement that the tables had turned. The Elamite rule was a complex affair. While they were the dominant military power, they did not attempt to completely replace the existing Sumerian and Akkadian administrative structures. Instead, they often ruled through a combination of their own officials and loyal local puppets. This pragmatic approach allowed them to maintain control without the immense administrative burden of a full-scale imperial occupation. However, their presence was felt everywhere. They controlled the trade routes and the flow of goods, ensuring that the economic bounty of the Mesopotamian plain now flowed eastward to their capital in Susa. They also exerted control over the religious life of the region, ensuring that the temples and their vast resources served the interests of the new hegemonic power. For the Sumerian and Akkadian city-states, this was a period of profound humiliation. Their civilization, once the unrivaled beacon of urban power and cultural sophistication, was now under the thumb of the very people they had so long viewed as a less civilized enemy. The Elamite occupation was a constant reminder of their defeat. The physical presence of Elamite armies in their cities, the sight of their administrators in the halls of power, and the loss of their economic and political independence were a daily testament to the new reality. The period immediately following the sack of Ur, therefore, was a time of Elamite triumph and Mesopotamian subjugation. The centuries-long rivalry had finally been settled, and for the first time, it was the Elamite who was victorious. Their moment of triumph, however, would be short-lived, as the political landscape of the ancient Near East was already shifting, and new, powerful rivals were preparing to challenge their newfound hegemony. The Elamite victory over the Sumerians was not merely a military or political triumph. It was a profound spiritual conquest, a reality most powerfully expressed through their practice of seizing the cult statues of the defeated Sumerian deities as war trophies. This act was a deliberate and symbolic form of subjugation that went far beyond the plunder of material wealth. For the peoples of the ancient Near East, a city's god was its divine protector, and the statue of that god was believed to be the living embodiment of its presence on earth. To capture an enemy's cult statue was to capture its very essence, and to demonstrate the spiritual superiority of the conqueror. Historical and religious texts from both Sumer and Elam confirm the significance of this practice. The lament for Ur speaks of the gods, particularly the city's patron deity, Nana, abandoning their temples, an event that was understood to precede the physical removal of their statues. The Lamentations mourn this departure as a profound catastrophe, signaling the end of the city's divine protection and its cosmic relevance. The Elamites, in turn, meticulously recorded their successes in this spiritual war. Inscriptions from the Samashki dynasty, the very rulers who sacked Ur, boast of their triumph over the Sumerian pantheon and their capture of the sacred statues. These were not simply listed as part of the general spoils of war, they were given a special place of honor, their names carefully recorded as a testament to the magnitude of the spiritual victory. The stolen statues were taken to the Elamite capital of Susa and other major cities, where they were placed in a pantry of the gods or a similar ritual space. This act was a powerful statement of cultural and political dominance. It symbolized the subjugation of the enemy's cosmos and the forced submission of their deities to the Elamite pantheon. By holding a rival's god captive, the Elamites were able to claim a portion of that god's power and religious authority. It was a practice that fundamentally shifted the religious balance of power, with the Elamite deities now seen as more powerful and victorious than their defeated Sumerian counterparts. This religious subjugation had tangible political and social consequences. For the conquered Sumerian population, the absence of their divine protectors was a daily, painful reminder of their subjugated status. Their temples, once bustling centers of life and worship, were now empty husks, and their religious rituals were rendered meaningless without the presence of their gods. This spiritual vacuum contributed to a sense of despair and cultural trauma, which the laments so powerfully convey. For the Elamites, the practice of capturing gods was a ritualized act of legitimation. It was a way for their rulers to demonstrate their power and to assert that their victory was divinely sanctioned. This act transformed the military triumph into a permanent spiritual reality, a testament to a conquest that was final and total. The return of the stolen gods would become a central theme of later conflicts, as subsequent Mesopotamian rulers would launch their own campaigns not just for land or tribute, but for the sacred mission of recovering their captive deities and restoring the cosmic order. The destruction of the city of Ur and the collapse of its empire did not lead to a new Elamite imperial rule over all of Mesopotamia. Instead, it ushered in a period of political fragmentation known to historians as the Age of Eisen and Larsa. This era, lasting for roughly 2 centuries, was a time of political instability and perpetual warfare between a series of smaller, independent city-states. This fragmentation of Sumerian power, a direct result of the fall of the Ur-3 state, provided the Elamites with a new strategic advantage. They were able to maintain their influence over the region from afar, exploiting the internal conflicts of their rivals and preventing the rise of a new unified Mesopotamian power that could threaten their newfound hegemony. The Age of Eisen and Larsa was a stark contrast to the centralized bureaucratic state of the Ur-3 Empire. Power was divided between a number of competing city-states, the most prominent of which were Izin and Larsa, each with its own king and its own claims to the legacy of the fallen dynasty. These cities and their smaller neighbors engaged in a continuous series of military conflicts for control over territory, water rights, and trade routes. These wars, while frequent, were rarely decisive. They were a form of perpetual, low-intensity conflict that prevented any single city-state from achieving the kind of hegemonic dominance that the Ur-3 and Akkadian empires had once commanded. The Elamites, with their capital in Susa, were able to use this political fragmentation to their advantage. They had no need for a full-scale occupation of Mesopotamia. Instead, they could exert their will through a series of subtle and sophisticated military and diplomatic maneuvers. They would form alliances with one city-state against another, providing military aid or mercenaries in exchange for tribute or political concessions. This divide-and-conquer strategy allowed them to maintain a powerful influence over the region's politics without the immense administrative burden of a direct occupation. Elamite kings would send diplomatic missions to the Mesopotamian courts, a constant reminder of their power, and their armies were always on standby to intervene when the balance of power threatened to shift against their interests. The most powerful tool of Elamite influence during this period was their control over the captured statues of the gods. The gods taken from Ur, including the statues of Nana and other deities, remained in Elamite possession, and Mesopotamian kings were forced to enter into diplomatic negotiations to secure their return. This gave the Elamites immense leverage, a powerful bargaining chip that they used to extract political concessions and immense tribute. The return of the stolen gods was a recurring theme in Mesopotamian politics during this period, and it ensured that the Elamites were a constant presence in the minds of their rivals, even when their armies were not on the battlefield. The Age of Eisen and Larsa was a period of Sumerian fragmentation and Elamite influence, a time when the rivalry, though changed in form, was as intense as ever. The Age of Eisen and Larsa, while characterized by the fragmentation of Sumerian power, also saw a new and more direct form of Elamite engagement with the Mesopotamian plain. The Elamites did not merely exert their influence from afar through diplomacy and military threats. They established a tangible administrative and military presence in the heart of Sumerian territory. This physical occupation of key urban centers marked a pivotal moment in their long rivalry, as it demonstrated the Elamite capacity to not only conquer, but to govern the lands of their ancient rivals. Historical records, including a number of cuneiform administrative texts from the Old Babylonian period, confirm the nature of this Elamite occupation. These documents, recovered from a variety of sites, detail the presence of Elamite officials in cities such as Isin, which had been a major power in the post-Ur III era. Elamite military garrisons were stationed in these cities, and Elamite administrators were put in charge of local affairs, including the collection of taxes and the management of temple economies. This was a system of direct rule, an overt exercise of sovereignty that contrasted with the more indirect influence the Elamites had wielded over the region during the earlier periods of fragmentation. The Elamite rule over these Mesopotamian cities was not a fleeting affair. The military control was often buttressed by diplomatic alliances and the strategic placement of loyal local rulers. The Elamites also used their powerful military to maintain control over the trade routes that flowed through the Mesopotamian plain, ensuring that the economic benefits of this physical presence were maximized. Their armies, a cohesive force of disciplined soldiers from the Susa-based army and mobile highland warriors, were a constant reminder of their power, and they were used to swiftly suppress any internal rebellions or challenges to their authority. This physical presence in the Mesopotamian plain gave the Elamites an immense strategic advantage. It allowed them to directly control key economic hubs, ensuring a steady flow of tribute and resources back to their kingdom. It also gave them a platform from which to intervene in the complex web of political conflicts that defined the Age of Isin and Larsa. The Elamites were able to act as kingmakers, throwing their military weight behind one city-state or another to ensure that no single power would emerge to challenge their regional dominance. The Elamite presence in the Mesopotamian plain was therefore a new and more aggressive phase of their rivalry. They had moved beyond simply plundering their rivals' cities and had established a direct form of rule that was both military and administrative. This period, while short-lived in the grand sweep of history, was a powerful demonstration of Elam's capacity for imperial administration. It was a clear and concise statement that they were not just a formidable military force, but a legitimate governing power, capable of ruling the lands of their ancient rivals and establishing a physical presence in the heart of Sumerian civilization. The Age of Isin and Larsa, defined by its political fragmentation, also gave rise to a new power that would challenge Elamite hegemony directly. This new force was led by the Amorite king Gungunum of Larsa, a figure who, through military prowess and strategic alliances, would lead a coalition of city-states against the Elamite presence in the plain. His campaign was not a spontaneous act of rebellion, but a long and arduous military effort that ultimately resulted in the liberation of Mesopotamia from Elamite influence. This was a pivotal moment, as it demonstrated that a Mesopotamian power could once again defeat its ancient rival. Gungunum's rise to power was a product of the internal politics of the Age of Isin and Larsa. His city-state Larsa was a prominent rival of Isin, and his consolidation of authority was a necessary prelude to his larger geopolitical ambitions. Historical records, including administrative texts and royal inscriptions from his reign, meticulously document his military achievements. He systematically brought the cities of his region under his control, securing a solid power base from which to challenge the Elamites. His campaign against the Elamite presence was a strategic masterstroke. Instead of engaging in a single decisive battle, he waged a war of attrition, targeting Elamite garrisons and their local allies in a series of coordinated military operations. Gungunum's success lay in his ability to form a broad coalition of city-states. He was able to convince other rulers, who had suffered under Elamite rule or feared their expanding influence, to join his cause. This alliance provided him with the necessary manpower and resources to challenge the powerful Elamite army directly. The coalition was a testament to the shared sense of grievance against the foreign occupiers and a collective desire to restore Mesopotamian sovereignty. The campaign was not easy. The Elamite military, with its disciplined urban soldiers and mobile highland warriors, was a formidable opponent, and Gungunum's forces were forced to fight a long and costly war to dislodge them. The climax of the campaign was the siege and capture of a series of cities that were under direct Elamite rule, including Izin. These were not quick victories. They required a mastery of siegecraft and a logistical system capable of supporting armies for extended periods. Gungunum's military triumphs were celebrated in his own royal inscriptions, which proudly proclaim his role as the king who drove out the Elamites and the liberator of Sumer. These texts served a dual purpose. They solidified his legitimacy as a new hegemonic power, and they provided a powerful narrative of a people's redemption from foreign rule. The liberation of the Mesopotamian plain from Elamite influence was a defining moment in the rivalry. It demonstrated that Elamite hegemony was not permanent, and that a well-organized, unified Mesopotamian power could once again defeat its ancient rival. While it did not end the conflict entirely, it set the stage for the rise of a new power that would finally settle the rivalry once and for all, the Kingdom of Babylon under the rule of Hammurabi. Gungunum's campaign was a pivotal turning point, a final act of the Age of Izin and Larsa that led directly to a new era of Mesopotamian power and a final showdown with Elam. The fragmentation of power that defined the Age of Izin and Larsa was brought to a decisive end with the rise of a new state, the Kingdom of Babylon. Under the rule of its most famous king, Hammurabi, this relatively minor city-state was transformed into a dominant empire that would unify Mesopotamia and once again bring a powerful, centralized enemy to Elam's doorstep. Hammurabi's consolidation of power was a process of military conquest, political maneuvering, and legal reform that fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the ancient Near East, setting the stage for the final and definitive phase of the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry. Hammurabi's early reign was characterized by a period of strategic alliances and internal strengthening. He first focused on securing his own territory, expanding Babylon's control over the surrounding regions, and establishing a stable and prosperous kingdom. His famous law code, a comprehensive legal document that was inscribed on monumental steles and placed in key cities, was a powerful tool in this process. It provided a uniform legal system, a sense of order, and a new ideological foundation for his rule. This administrative and legal consolidation provided the necessary stability for his later military campaigns. His unification of Mesopotamia was not a single grand conquest, but a series of calculated military and diplomatic victories. He first formed a powerful alliance with the Elamites, using their military might to defeat his Mesopotamian rivals, most notably the Kingdom of Larsa. This was a pragmatic and strategic partnership, a temporary alliance of convenience against a common enemy. The Elamites, with their strong army and their long history of dominance, saw Hammurabi as a useful ally who would help them to maintain their influence over the Mesopotamian plain. They provided military support to Hammurabi's campaigns, a decision that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. After defeating his Mesopotamian rivals and securing his control over the entire plain, Hammurabi turned his attention to his erstwhile allies, the Elamites. His campaign against them was a masterful stroke of military and political genius. He used a combination of deception and overwhelming force, launching a surprise attack against the very people who had helped him to rise to power. His armies were superior in every way. They were a disciplined, professional force that was well equipped and well supplied by a unified and prosperous state. This military machine, which had been perfected in the wars against his Mesopotamian rivals, was now unleashed on the unsuspecting Elamites. The Babylonian ascendancy thus marked a new phase of the conflict. The Elamites, who for centuries had exploited the political fragmentation of Mesopotamia, were now faced with a unified, centralized, and powerful enemy that was determined to settle the rivalry once and for all. Hammurabi's consolidation of power brought an end to the chaotic Age of Izin and Larsa, and ushered in an era of a single hegemonic power. The stage was set for the final act of a centuries-long conflict, a war that would determine the ultimate fate of both civilizations. The Elamites had helped to create their own demise, unwittingly raising a new and formidable enemy that would finally bring their influence to an end. The ascent of Hammurabi of Babylon, while seemingly a domestic Mesopotamian affair, cast a long and ominous shadow over the Elamite kingdom. The military and diplomatic exchanges between Hammurabi and the Elamite rulers during the 18th century BCE were a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and strategic miscalculations that would ultimately define the final phase of their rivalry. For a time, the Elamites, who had for so long exploited the political fragmentation of Mesopotamia, found themselves in an alliance of convenience with a rising power. This relationship, however, was not based on mutual trust, but on a pragmatic recognition of shared, short-term interests. Historical records, including a number of well-preserved cuneiform letters and royal edicts, provide a wealth of information about this era. These texts reveal that Hammurabi's diplomatic approach to Elam was as shrewd as his military strategy. He engaged in a series of correspondences with Elamite kings, negotiating treaties and offering military support. The Elamites, with their strong army and a long history of success in their dealings with fragmented Mesopotamian states, saw Hammurabi as a useful instrument to further their own goals. They provided military aid to his campaigns against his Mesopotamian rivals, most notably the Kingdom of Larsa. This was a calculated risk. The Elamites believed that by helping to defeat the other powerful city-states in the plain, they would be able to maintain their influence over the region, with Hammurabi serving as their puppet ruler. This strategic partnership, however, was built on a foundation of fundamental misunderstanding. The Elamites, with their long history of dominance, failed to recognize the true nature of Hammurabi's ambition. They saw him as a temporary ally, a useful tool to maintain the fragmentation that served their interests. They did not understand that he was not seeking a limited victory. He was seeking total dominion. He was not just a king of a small city-state. He was a master strategist with a grand vision of a unified empire. The Elamites' miscalculation was their inability to see beyond their own immediate interests and to recognize the long-term threat that a unified Mesopotamia, under a single powerful ruler, would pose to their own sovereignty. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and decisive. After defeating his Mesopotamian rivals and securing his control over the entire plain, Hammurabi turned his attention to the Elamites. He used the very alliance they had forged as a means to launch a surprise attack. His campaign against them was a masterful stroke of military and political genius. He used a combination of deception and overwhelming force, launching an attack against the unsuspecting Elamites. His armies were superior in every way. They were a disciplined, professional force that was well-equipped and well-supplied by a unified and prosperous state. This military machine, which had been perfected in the wars against his Mesopotamian rivals, was now unleashed on his erstwhile allies. The Elamites were caught completely off guard, their army was defeated, and their influence over the Mesopotamian plain was brought to a decisive end. The shadow of the conqueror, which they had so long exploited, had finally fallen over them. The long and complex rivalry between Mesopotamia and Elam reached its definitive conclusion in a final, climactic military conflict. This last major war was instigated by the Babylonian king Hammurabi, who, after consolidating his control over the entire Mesopotamian plain, turned his full attention to his erstwhile Elamite allies. This was a war of total dominion, a final showdown that would ultimately seal Elam's fate and ensure Babylonian hegemony over the ancient Near East for centuries to come. The campaigns were a culmination of all the military and logistical innovations that had been perfected by the Mesopotamians over a millennium of warfare. The war began with a decisive act of betrayal. Hammurabi, having used Elamite military aid to defeat his Mesopotamian rivals, launched a surprise attack on the unsuspecting Elamite kingdom. His armies, a well-disciplined and professional force, were far superior to the Elamite military, which had grown complacent in its alliance with the rising Babylonian power. The speed and scale of the attack caught the Elamite king, Kutia-Nahunte, completely off guard. The Babylonian army, fueled by a unified and prosperous state, was able to penetrate deep into Elamite territory, bypassing their border defenses and striking directly at their political and economic heartland. The campaigns were a series of methodical and well-planned military operations. Hammurabi's army, with its superior organization and advanced siege technology, systematically captured and destroyed key Elamite strongholds. The military prowess of the Babylonians was unmatched. Their disciplined infantry formations, supported by archers and a sophisticated logistical system, were able to withstand any counterattack. The Elamite forces, a more loosely organized confederation of urban soldiers and highland warriors, were no match for the professional, centralized military of the Babylonian Empire. The defeat of the Elamite king Kutir-Nahunte marked the end of a long and bloody conflict. The Babylonian victory was absolute. Elamite military power was broken, their political unity was shattered, and their influence over the Mesopotamian plain was brought to a decisive end. The Babylonian armies seized an immense amount of tribute, including precious metals, slaves, and, most importantly, the cultic objects of the defeated Elamite gods. These were taken back to Babylon as a powerful symbol of Hammurabi's triumph and the complete subjugation of his ancient rival. The final Elamite-Sumerian War thus ended in a complete victory for the Mesopotamian power. The aftermath of the war saw a fundamental shift in the geopolitical landscape. The Elamite kingdom, its military and political structures dismantled, was reduced to a regional power, its hegemonic ambitions forever crushed. Its control over the trade routes and its influence over the Mesopotamian plain were now under the complete control of the Babylonian Empire. For the Sumerians and Akkadians, this was a final act of redemption, a definitive end to a rivalry that had defined their history for over a millennium. The victory of Hammurabi ensured Babylonian dominance and brought an end to the oldest continuous war in human history. The conflict, which had for so long been a story of shifting power and cyclical violence, was finally brought to a decisive conclusion. The decisive victory of Hammurabi over the Elamites, while seemingly a permanent end to the ancient rivalry, was followed by a period of profound geopolitical change that would temporarily put the conflict on hold. This new era was ushered in by the Kassites, a foreign people who, like the Gutians and Elamites before them, originated from the Zagros Mountains. Their rise to power in Babylon marked a new phase in Mesopotamian history, one characterized by a long period of stability and a temporary suspension of the cyclical warfare that had defined the region for centuries. The Kassite invasion was not a violent overthrow of the Babylonian Empire, but a more gradual process of political and military infiltration. Historical and administrative texts from the period suggest that the Kassites, who had long served as mercenaries in the armies of both Babylon and Elam, were able to take advantage of the internal weaknesses and succession crises that plagued the Babylonian state after the death of Hammurabi. They systematically gained control over the key cities and institutions of the empire, and they were able to establish their own dynasty without a major military conflict. Their rule was a stark contrast to the chaotic and disruptive occupation of the Gutians. It was a period of long-term stability and administrative continuity. The Kassite era, which lasted for over 4 centuries, was a time of geopolitical balance in the ancient Near East. Their relationship with their neighbors, particularly the Elamites, was defined by a long period of diplomatic exchange and relative peace. This was a result of a new political reality. The Kassite rulers of Babylon were more focused on maintaining a stable and prosperous state than on military expansion. They were content to rule over their Mesopotamian kingdom and to engage in diplomatic relations with their neighbors, rather than engaging in the kind of aggressive, hegemonic warfare that had defined the era of Sargon and Hammurabi. This shift in foreign policy, from conquest to stability, provided the Elamites with a long period of respite, a chance to rebuild their kingdom and to reassert their own power in their highlands. The Kassite interlude was also a time of significant cultural exchange. The Kassites, who were of a different linguistic and cultural background, were assimilated into the dominant Babylonian culture. They adopted the cuneiform script, the Mesopotamian pantheon, and the administrative practices of the land they now ruled. Their rule was a testament to the enduring power of Mesopotamian civilization to absorb and transform its conquerors. This assimilation also had a profound effect on their relationship with the Elamites. They were now a Mesopotamian power, and their interests, while different from their predecessors, were now intertwined with the fate of the plain. The Kassite interlude thus marks a unique period in the long rivalry between Mesopotamia and Elam. It was a time of geopolitical stability that put the ancient conflict on hold. The Kassites, a foreign power who took control of Babylon, were more interested in maintaining a stable state than in military expansion. Their rule provided the Elamites with a much-needed period of peace, a chance to rebuild and to prepare for a new conflict that would arise when the geopolitical balance of the ancient Near East shifted once more. The long period of geopolitical stability that defined the Kassite interlude in Mesopotamia provided the Elamites with a crucial opportunity for internal renewal. While the Kassite rulers of Babylon were more focused on administration than on military expansion, a new and ambitious dynasty, the Igi-Halkid, was rising to power in the Elamite highlands. This new era marked the re-emergence of Elamite military power and a period of renewed cultural and political vigor that would see Elam expand its influence across the region once more, setting the stage for a new and final round in their ancient rivalry. The Igi-Halkid dynasty, which ruled Elam for roughly a century and a half, was a period of significant consolidation and military reform. Historical and administrative texts from the period confirm that the Igi-Halkid rulers were able to bring the disparate highland groups and urban centers under a single cohesive authority. This unification was a direct result of a new imperial ideology that sought to transform Elam from a decentralized collection of cities and clans into a powerful, centralized empire. The military was professionalized, with soldiers serving as full-time state employees, and a sophisticated logistical system was developed to support long-distance campaigns. This military machine, which had been dormant for centuries, was now once again a major force in the ancient Near East. The Igi-Halkid dynasty's renewed strength was not confined to military matters. It was also a period of significant cultural achievement. Royal inscriptions and monumental architecture from the period reflect a new and confident Elamite identity, one that was no longer defined by its rivalry with Mesopotamia, but by its own unique cultural and artistic traditions. The Igi-Halkid rulers commissioned the construction of massive ziggurats, temples, and palaces, which served as powerful symbols of their imperial authority and their renewed prosperity. The art of this period, with its focus on intricate metalwork and elaborate sculpture, reflects a culture that was no longer on the defensive but was now a dominant force in the region. This re-emergence of a unified and militarily potent Elamite state was a direct challenge to the Kassite rulers of Babylon. The Kassites, who had for so long enjoyed a period of geopolitical stability, were now faced with a powerful and aggressive new rival that was determined to reassert its influence over the Mesopotamian plain. The Elamites, with their revitalized army and a new imperial ideology, began to launch a series of campaigns that were aimed at seizing control of the trade routes and the buffer zones that lay between their highlands and the Mesopotamian lowlands. These military operations were a clear and decisive statement that the balance of power had shifted once more. The Igi-Halkid dynasty thus marks a pivotal moment in the long rivalry between Elam and Mesopotamia. It was a period of renewed cultural and military vigor that saw Elam expand its influence across the region once more. The long period of Kassite stability had provided them with a much-needed period of peace, a chance to rebuild and to prepare for a new conflict that would arise when the geopolitical balance of the ancient Near East shifted once more. The stage was set for a new and final round in their ancient rivalry, a war that would determine the ultimate fate of both civilizations. The Elamites had helped to create their own demise, unwittingly raising a new and formidable enemy that would finally bring their influence to an end. The long period of Kassite rule in Mesopotamia, a time of relative stability and cultural assimilation, was brought to a decisive and stunning end by the resurgent military power of the Igi-Halkid dynasty of Elam. The Elamite military, revitalized and professionalized, launched a full-scale invasion of the Babylonian kingdom, a war that was not merely for conquest, but for the destruction of Kassite rule and the assertion of Elamite hegemony. The culmination of this conflict was the sack of Babylon, a decisive victory that ended the Kassite dynasty and allowed the Elamites to seize one of the most powerful symbols of Mesopotamian civilization, the stele of Hammurabi's law code. The invasion of Babylon was a masterstroke of military strategy. The Elamite king, Shutruk-Nahante I, a powerful and ambitious ruler, launched a series of campaigns that were aimed at the very heart of the Kassite kingdom. Historical records, including later Babylonian chronicles and Elamite inscriptions, confirm the scale of this invasion. The Elamite army, a well-disciplined and professional force, was able to penetrate deep into Babylonian territory, bypassing their defenses and striking directly at the Kassite capital. The military was superior in every way. They were a professional, well-equipped force that was fueled by a unified and prosperous state. This military machine, which had been dormant for centuries, was now once again a major force in the ancient Near East. The sack of Babylon was a swift and brutal affair. The city, which had for so long been the center of a stable empire, was unprepared for the ferocity of the Elamite attack. The Kassite army, a more loosely organized force, was no match for the professional, centralized military of the Elamite Empire. The Elamite army, with its superior siege technology and its well-disciplined infantry formations, was able to breach the city walls and to sack the capital. What followed was a systematic destruction of the city's key institutions. The Kassite royal palace was plundered and burned, and the great temples, symbols of Babylonian power, were razed. The most significant act of this conquest was not the plunder of gold or silver, but the seizure of the stele of Hammurabi's law code. This monumental object, which contained the comprehensive legal system that had defined Babylonian rule, was carried away to Susa as a prized trophy. This was a powerful act of spiritual and political humiliation. By capturing the law code, the Elamites were not just seizing a piece of stone, they were capturing the very essence of Babylonian civilization. They were demonstrating their superiority over their ancient rivals, a victory that was more profound than any military conquest. The sack of Babylon and the seizure of the law code marked a decisive shift in the geopolitical landscape. The Kassite dynasty, which had ruled for over 4 centuries, was brought to an end, and a new period of political fragmentation and chaos was ushered in. For the Elamites, this was a final act of triumph, a culmination of a centuries-long rivalry that had for so long been a story of shifting power and cyclical violence. They had not just defeated their ancient rival, they had brought their empire to ruin. The sack of Babylon thus stands as a powerful testament to the enduring power of the Elamite people and their capacity for vengeance. The Elamite sack of Babylon, culminating in the defeat of the Kassite dynasty, was a moment of profound military triumph, but its most enduring consequence was a symbolic one. The decision by the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahante I to seize the stele of Hammurabi's law code was a strategic and political act that transcended mere plunder. This monumental object, which contained the comprehensive legal system that had defined Babylonian rule, was not simply a piece of stone. It was the very embodiment of Mesopotamian civilization's legal, social, and cultural identity. Its removal to the Elamite capital of Susa was a powerful assertion of dominance that would fuel Babylonian resentment for centuries. The law code's significance was multifaceted. For the Babylonians, it represented the pinnacle of their legal and administrative achievements. It provided a uniform legal system, a sense of order, and a new ideological foundation for their rule. It was a tangible testament to their divine right to govern and to their cultural superiority over their neighbors. The stele was not just a legal document, it was a sacred object, a physical manifestation of the cosmic order that the Babylonian kings claimed to uphold. Its presence in the heart of their kingdom was a constant reminder of their divinely sanctioned authority. For the Elamites, the capture of the stele was a masterful stroke of political and psychological warfare. By carrying away the law code to Susa, they were not just demonstrating their military might, They were claiming the historical and legal legacy of Mesopotamia for themselves. They were asserting that they, and not the defeated Kassites, were the true heirs to the civilization of Hammurabi. The stele was placed in the temple of their national god in Shushinak, a powerful statement that their victory was divinely sanctioned and that their god was superior to the gods of Babylon. This act of spiritual subjugation was a more profound victory than any military conquest, as it sought to rewrite the very narrative of Mesopotamian history. The presence of the stolen law code in the Elamite capital was a constant source of humiliation and resentment for the Babylonians. The texts of the period, including later Babylonian chronicles, lament the loss of their sacred object and speak of a period of national shame. The return of the law code became a central theme of Babylonian political rhetoric, a sacred mission that would be used to rally armies and justify future conflicts. For the Babylonians, the return of the law code was not just about recovering a piece of stone, it was about restoring their national honor, their legal legacy, and their cultural identity. The seizure of the law code therefore stands as a powerful testament to the symbolic nature of this ancient rivalry. The Elamites understood that to truly defeat a civilization, you must capture its very essence. The stolen law code thus became a central symbol of a conflict that was not just about land or tribute, but about the very soul of a civilization. The law code, which had for so long defined Babylonian rule, now served to define their subjugated status. Its presence in the Elamite capital was a constant reminder of their defeat. The long-standing rivalry between Elam and Babylon, a conflict that had defined the ancient Near East for centuries, was soon to be overshadowed by a new and more formidable power from the north. The Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, with their capital in Assur and later Nineveh, were a people whose relentless military expansion and strategic ambitions would eventually place them in a position of dominance over both of their ancient rivals. The rise of Assyria marked a new phase in the geopolitical landscape, as the conflicts of the past were now played out under the long, dark shadow of a truly global superpower. The Kassite defeat at the hands of the Elamites, which brought an end to a long period of stability, created a power vacuum that the Assyrians were quick to exploit. The Assyrian kings, who had for so long been a regional power, now began a period of aggressive military expansion that was fueled by a professional standing army and a sophisticated administrative system. The Assyrian military machine was a marvel of ancient engineering and organization. It was characterized by its professional standing army, its superior weaponry, and a logistical system capable of supporting campaigns far from its heartland. This military machine, which had been perfected in centuries of warfare, was now unleashed on both the Elamites and the Babylonians. The Assyrian approach to foreign policy was a stark contrast to the more nuanced diplomacy of their predecessors. It was a policy of total and overwhelming military dominance, and it was aimed at the subjugation of all of their rivals. The Assyrian kings, with their powerful army, systematically conquered the territories of both Elam and Babylon. They installed loyal governors, collected immense amounts of tribute, and deported entire populations to break their will to resist. The Assyrians were not just interested in military conquest, they were interested in the complete subjugation of their rivals' political and cultural identities. The Assyrians, in their military campaigns, made it a point to seize and destroy the great symbols of their rivals' civilizations. They sacked the Elamite capital of Susa, they plundered the temples of Babylon, and they carried away the great statues of the defeated gods. This was a powerful act of spiritual and political humiliation, a statement that their god, Assur, was superior to all the gods of their rivals. The Assyrian kings, with their royal inscriptions and their monumental art, proudly proclaimed their victories and their role as the rightful rulers of the ancient Near East. The rise of Assyria thus marked a new and final phase in the long rivalry between Elam and Babylon. The ancient conflict, which had for so long been a story of shifting power and cyclical violence, was now overshadowed by a new power that was determined to settle all rivalries once and for all. The Assyrian Empire, with its relentless military expansion and its strategic ambitions, was a force that neither Elam nor Babylon could defeat. The conflicts of the past were now subsumed into a new and larger imperial project, a struggle for survival against a superpower that would not rest until it had brought all of its rivals to their knees. The rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire presented the Elamites with a new and existential threat, one that was far more powerful and aggressive than any of their previous Mesopotamian rivals. The final centuries of Elamite independence were defined by a desperate and ultimately futile struggle against the overwhelming might of this new superpower. This was a period of constant warfare, of brutal campaigns and protracted sieges that saw the Elamite state brought to its knees and their civilization systematically dismantled by a ruthless and efficient imperial machine. The Assyrian campaigns against Elam were not a series of raids or punitive expeditions. They were a war of annihilation. The Assyrian kings, with their professional standing army and their vast resources, were determined to settle the rivalry once and for all. Historical records, including royal inscriptions and a number of administrative texts, provide a wealth of information about these campaigns. The Assyrian armies, with their superior siege technology and their well-disciplined infantry formations, were able to penetrate deep into Elamite territory, bypassing their defenses and striking directly at their political and economic heartland. The Elamite forces, a more loosely organized confederation of urban soldiers and highland warriors, were no match for the professional, centralized military of the Assyrian Empire. The climax of this conflict was a series of brutal sieges and campaigns that culminated in the destruction of the Elamite capital of Susa. The Assyrian kings, with their powerful army, systematically laid waste to the Elamite cities and their surrounding territories. They seized immense amounts of tribute, including precious metals, slaves, and, most importantly, the cultic objects of the defeated Elamite gods. These were taken back to Assyria as a powerful symbol of their triumph and the complete subjugation of their ancient rival. The Assyrian kings, with their royal inscriptions and their monumental art, proudly proclaimed their victories and their role as the rightful rulers of the ancient Near East. The defeat of the Elamites was not a single decisive battle. It was a long and arduous war of attrition that lasted for decades. The Elamites, with their decentralized power structure and their mastery of the mountainous terrain, proved to be an exceptionally resilient opponent. Their continuous resistance, even after their leaders were defeated and their cities were sacked, drained Assyrian resources and stretched the empire's military to its breaking point. However, the overwhelming might of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was a force that neither Elam nor Babylon could defeat. The conflicts of the past were now subsumed into a new and larger imperial project, a struggle for survival against a superpower that would not rest until it had brought all of its rivals to their knees. The Elamite last stand was a tragic and poignant moment in the history of the ancient Near East. The Elamites, a people who had for so long been a powerful and independent force, were now reduced to a series of fragmented and subjugated territories. Their military power was broken, their political unity was shattered, and their influence over the region was brought to a decisive end. The defeat of the Elamites was a final and definitive end to their ancient rivalry, and it marked a new era of Assyrian dominance over the ancient Near East. The culmination of the Elamite struggle against the Neo-Assyrian Empire was a devastating military and cultural act. The complete annihilation of the Elamite capital of Susa. This was not a simple capture of a city. It was a deliberate and systematic destruction under the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, an event so profound that it effectively ended Elam's role as a military and political power for centuries. The sack of Susa was the final and definitive act of a war of attrition, a ruthless display of imperial might designed to erase the very memory of a long-standing rival. Ashurbanipal's campaign against Elam was the result of decades of military and political maneuvering. The Assyrians, after a series of brutal wars, were determined to settle the rivalry once and for all. Historical records, including a number of well-preserved cuneiform tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, provide a wealth of information about this final campaign. The Assyrian king, with his professional standing army and his vast resources, launched a full-scale invasion of the Elamite kingdom, a war that was aimed at the very heart of the Elamite state. The Assyrian army, with its superior siege technology and its well-disciplined infantry formations, was able to penetrate deep into Elamite territory, bypassing their defenses and striking directly at their political and economic heartland. The siege of Susa itself was a masterpiece of ancient military strategy. The Assyrian army, with its powerful artillery and its well-disciplined infantry formations, systematically laid waste to the city's defenses. The city, which had for so long been the center of a powerful empire, was unprepared for the ferocity of the Assyrian attack. The Elamite forces, a more loosely organized confederation of urban soldiers and highland warriors, were no match for the professional, centralized military of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian army, with its superior siege technology and its well-disciplined infantry formations, was able to breach the city walls and to sack the capital. What followed was a systematic destruction of the city's key institutions. The sack of Susa was a ritualized act of vengeance. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions boast of his triumph and of his systematic destruction of the city. He proudly proclaims how he razed the great temples, destroyed the royal palaces, and plundered the tombs of the Elamite kings. The Assyrians seized an immense amount of tribute, including precious metals, slaves, and, most importantly, the cultic objects of the defeated Elamite gods. These were taken back to Assyria as a powerful symbol of their triumph and the complete subjugation of their ancient rival. The Assyrian kings, with their royal inscriptions and their monumental art, proudly proclaimed their victories and their role as the rightful rulers of the ancient Near East. The annihilation of Susa thus marked a final and definitive end to the ancient rivalry between Elam and Mesopotamia. The Elamite kingdom, its military and political structures dismantled, was reduced to a series of fragmented and subjugated territories. Their military power was broken, their political unity was shattered, and their influence over the region was brought to a decisive end. The defeat of the Elamites was a final and definitive end to their ancient rivalry, and it marked a new era of Assyrian dominance over the ancient Near East. The Neo-Assyrian campaign against Elam, culminating in the sack of Susa, is not merely a historical event, it is a meticulously documented act of vengeance. The most profound source for this documentation is the Library of Ashurbanipal, a massive collection of cuneiform tablets discovered at the ancient site of Nineveh. This library, which contains an immense wealth of historical, literary, and administrative texts, provides a detailed, if profoundly biased, account of the final Assyrian campaign against Elam and the brutal terms of its defeat. It is through these tablets that we can understand the Assyrian perspective on their long rivalry with Elam, a perspective that was defined by a desire for total and permanent subjugation. The tablets from the library reveal the Assyrian military strategy in detail. They speak of a methodical and systematic campaign, aimed not just at winning battles but at the total destruction of the Elamite state. The inscriptions describe how the Assyrian army, with its superior siege technology and its professional disciplined formations, was able to penetrate deep into Elamite territory, bypassing their defenses and striking directly at their political and economic heartland. The Assyrian kings, with their royal inscriptions and their monumental art, proudly proclaimed their victories and their role as the rightful rulers of the ancient Near East. The tablets detail the siege of Susa, a masterpiece of ancient military strategy, and the subsequent sack of the city. The account of the sack of Susa, as preserved in the library, is a ritualized act of vengeance. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions boast of his triumph and of his systematic destruction of the city. He proudly proclaims how he razed the great temples, destroyed the royal palaces, and plundered the tombs of the Elamite kings. The Assyrians seized an immense amount of tribute, including precious metals, slaves, and, most importantly, the cultic objects of the defeated Elamite gods. These were taken back to Assyria as a powerful symbol of their triumph and the complete subjugation of their ancient rival. The Assyrian kings, with their royal inscriptions and their monumental art, proudly proclaimed their victories and their role as the rightful rulers of the ancient Near East. However, the account is profoundly biased. The Assyrian narrative systematically omits any mention of their own military setbacks, their diplomatic failures, or the immense cost of their campaigns. The Elamites are portrayed not as a formidable rival, but as a treacherous and chaotic people who deserved their fate. The Assyrian victory is framed not as a military conquest, but as a righteous act of divine judgment, a cosmic punishment for a people who had for so long defied the authority of the Assyrian gods. The library, therefore, is not a neutral historical record. It is a powerful piece of political propaganda, a testament to the Assyrian king's self-proclaimed role as a divinely sanctioned conqueror. The Library of Ashurbanipal is a monument to a new kind of imperial power. The Assyrian kings were not content to simply conquer their rivals. They sought to control the historical narrative itself. They created a vast library, a repository of historical, literary, and religious texts that would serve as a powerful tool of imperial legitimation. The tablets from the library provide a detailed, if profoundly biased, account of the final Assyrian campaign against Elam and the brutal terms of its defeat. The library, therefore, is a testament to the Assyrian king's self-proclaimed role as a divinely sanctioned conqueror and a powerful symbol of the Assyrian Empire's ruthless efficiency. The annihilation of Elam as a military and political power by the Neo-Assyrian Empire did not erase its legacy. In a profound and ironic historical twist, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which would rise to dominate the ancient Near East, emerged from the very highlands that had been the heartland of Elamite civilization. The Persians, who had long been a semi-nomadic people, were assimilated into the culture and traditions of the Elamite state they had conquered. This was not a military conquest, but a cultural absorption, a process by which the Persians, a new imperial power, adopted the administrative, artistic, and even linguistic practices of their defeated rivals, making Susa a magnificent imperial capital once more. The assimilation of Elamite culture by the Persians was a deliberate and strategic process. The Persians, with their own language and traditions, recognized the immense value of the administrative and legal systems that the Elamites had developed over a millennium of statehood. They adopted the Elamite cuneiform script for their own monumental inscriptions, and they used Elamite scribes and administrators to manage their vast new empire. The Elamite capital of Susa, which had been systematically destroyed by the Assyrians, was rebuilt by the Persian kings, who recognized its strategic importance as a hub of trade and administration. Susa was transformed into a magnificent imperial capital, a city of grand palaces, monumental gates, and a sophisticated administrative center. The cultural influence of Elam on the Persians was profound. Elamite artistic traditions, particularly in metalwork and decorative sculpture, were absorbed and transformed by the Persians. The intricate animal interlace patterns and the use of polychrome glazed bricks, which had been a hallmark of Elamite art, were now used to adorn the royal palaces and the ceremonial gates of the Persian Empire. The Persians, with their newfound wealth and power, commissioned a series of monumental works that were a synthesis of Elamite, Assyrian, and Babylonian artistic traditions. This was a deliberate act of cultural appropriation, a way for the Persians to demonstrate their mastery over the artistic and cultural legacies of their defeated rivals. The Persian ascendancy thus marks a new and final chapter in the long history of Elam. The Elamite kingdom, which had for so long been a powerful and independent force, was now subsumed into a new and larger imperial project. The Persians, with their newfound wealth and power, were able to absorb the cultural and administrative legacies of their defeated rivals, a process that was a profound and ironic historical twist. The Elamite last stand was a tragic and poignant moment in the history of the ancient Near East. The Elamites, a people who had for so long been a powerful and independent force, were now reduced to a series of fragmented and subjugated territories. Their military power was broken, their political unity was shattered, and their influence over the region was brought to a decisive end. The defeat of the Elamites was a final and definitive end to their ancient rivalry, and it marked a new era of Assyrian dominance. The Assyrian destruction of the Elamite capital of Susa was a decisive military and cultural act, but the city's legacy proved more enduring than its physical structures. In a profound historical twist, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which would rise from the same highlands, chose to not only rebuild Susa, but to celebrate its unique heritage, making it a magnificent imperial capital once more. This was not an accidental occurrence. It was a deliberate act of political and cultural strategy that symbolized the continuation of Elamite power, albeit under new rulers. The Persians, in their new role as masters of a vast multi-ethnic empire, recognized the immense value of the administrative and architectural traditions they had inherited. Susa's architectural legacy, in particular, was meticulously preserved and celebrated. The city, which had been razed by the Assyrians, was rebuilt by the Persian kings on an unprecedented scale. They commissioned the construction of a series of grand palaces and administrative centers that were a testament to a new syncretic imperial ideology. This architecture was a powerful fusion of Elamite, Assyrian, and Babylonian styles. The Persians adopted and expanded upon Elamite innovations, such as the use of polychrome glazed bricks and intricate decorative motifs, to adorn their royal palaces and ceremonial gates. The result was a distinctive imperial style that both honored the city's heritage and asserted the new empire's authority over the artistic legacies of its defeated predecessors. The resurrection of Susa as a major imperial center was a powerful physical statement, demonstrating that the Persians had inherited the cultural mantle of the region. Beyond its physical grandeur, Susa's administrative traditions were also meticulously preserved. The Persians, in their new role as rulers of a multi-ethnic empire, recognized the immense value of the administrative and legal systems that the Elamites had developed over a millennium. They adopted the Elamite cuneiform script for their own monumental inscriptions, and they continued to use Elamite scribes and administrators to manage their vast new empire. The famous administrative archives of Persepolis, though found in another city, contain a wealth of information written in Elamite, confirming its status as a language of administration within the Persian Empire. This was a pragmatic decision. The Elamite system, with its sophisticated bureaucracy and its well-established methods of record-keeping, was perfectly suited to the needs of a large, centralized state. The resurrection of Susa thus marks a new chapter in the history of the ancient rivalry. The Elamite kingdom may have been defeated and its political power broken, but its cultural and administrative legacy endured. The Persians, who had risen from the same highlands, became the inheritors of this legacy. By rebuilding and celebrating Susa, they were not just rebuilding a city, they were adopting a heritage. The city's endurance, despite its destruction, stands as a testament to the sophistication and resilience of Elamite civilization, which, even in defeat, continued to shape the empires that followed it. The Neo-Assyrian destruction of Elam and the subsequent Persian ascendancy did not bring an end to the ancient rivalry between the peoples of the Mesopotamian plains and the Iranian highlands. It merely transformed it. The geopolitical contest, which had for so long been fought between Sumer and Elam, now continued for centuries under the new banners of Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The fundamental tensions that had defined the conflict over resources, trade routes, and imperial hegemony remained, but they were now played out on a much larger and more complex stage. The Persian conquest of both Babylon and the former Elamite territories created a new, hegemonic reality. For the first time, a single power ruled over both rival civilizations, absorbing their peoples and their lands into a single, vast empire. This was a temporary end to open warfare between the two regions, but it was not an end to the rivalry. The Persians, with their new capital at Susa, were now the inheritors of the Elamite administrative and cultural legacy, and they were the masters of the Mesopotamian plains. The Babylonians, though subjects of a new empire, maintained their own cultural and political identity, and their priests and scholars continued to harbor a deep resentment against their new rulers. This was a rivalry that had been subsumed into a new and larger imperial project, a tension that would define the internal politics of the Persian Empire for centuries. The conflict re-emerged in a new form with the arrival of the Greeks. Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire brought a new foreign power to the region, and it created an opportunity for the Babylonians to once again challenge the dominance of their rivals from the highlands. The Greek-ruled Seleucid Empire, which was established in the former territories of Alexander, became the new hegemonic power, and it found itself caught in the middle of this ancient rivalry. The Seleucids, who had their capital in Mesopotamia, were naturally more aligned with the interests of the Babylonians. This was a new chapter in the conflict, with the Babylonians now serving as allies of a new foreign power against their Persian rivals, who had once been the inheritors of the Elamite legacy. The conflict continued under the new banners of Romans and Parthians. The Romans, who succeeded the Greeks as the hegemonic power in the West, found themselves in a long and arduous struggle with the Parthian Empire, which was based in the Iranian highlands. This was a new phase in the ancient rivalry, with the Romans now serving as the inheritors of the Mesopotamian legacy and the Parthians as the inheritors of the Elamite legacy. The conflict, which had for so long been about resources and territory, was now about the fate of two vast competing empires. The rivalry between the peoples of the Mesopotamian plains and the Iranian highlands was thus not ended, but transformed. The fundamental tensions that had defined the conflict for over a millennium remained, but they were now played out on a much larger and more complex stage. The long history of conflict, which had for so long been a story of shifting power and cyclical violence, was now subsumed into a new and larger imperial project, a struggle for survival against a superpower that would not rest until it had brought all of its rivals to their knees. The long and complex rivalry between the peoples of the Mesopotamian plains and the Iranian highlands did not end with the fall of empires. It endured in the oral and written traditions of the cultures that followed them. A powerful testament to the longevity of this conflict is found in the biblical accounts of the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Genesis. These texts, while not a direct historical record of the Sumerian-Elamite wars, provide a remarkable echo of the ancient rivalry, demonstrating how the memory of this conflict persisted for centuries and was eventually woven into the foundational narratives of a new people. The most prominent reference is found in Genesis 14, which describes a war fought in the valley of Siddim. This account details a coalition of 4 kings from the east, led by Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, who waged a war against a confederacy of 5 city-states from the plains of Jordan and the Dead Sea. The Elamite king is portrayed as a dominant figure, a hegemonic power who had for 12 years held the kings of the plains in his thrall. The narrative culminates in a decisive battle in which the Elamite coalition is defeated by a single figure, Abram of the Hebrews, who leads a surprise attack to rescue his kinsman, Lot. The historical context of this account is a matter of scholarly debate. While the names of the kings and their cities do not always align with what we know from Mesopotamian cuneiform records, the overarching narrative of a powerful Elamite king leading a military coalition into the plains to assert his dominance is a striking parallel to the historical reality of the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry. The biblical text's portrayal of Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, as a hegemonic power who controls the kings of the plains, is a powerful echo of the historical periods in which Elamite kings, such as those of the Semashki and Igarhalkid dynasties, exerted their influence over Mesopotamia and its surrounding regions. The narrative of an Elamite king leading a coalition of kings against the cities of the plains is a familiar theme in the history of the ancient Near East, a pattern that was repeated for centuries. The inclusion of this narrative in the book of Genesis is a testament to the longevity of the conflict's oral and written traditions. It demonstrates that the memory of Elam as a dominant foreign power, a hegemonic force that could wage a war against the cities of the plains, was not lost to history. It was preserved in the cultural memory of the peoples of the ancient Near East, and was eventually woven into the foundational narratives of the Hebrews. The biblical account, therefore, is not a simple historical record. It is a profound cultural artifact, an echo of a centuries-long rivalry that had been transformed and preserved in the oral traditions of a new people. The echoes of the Elamite-Sumerian conflict, a struggle that had defined the ancient Near East for over a millennium, were thus not lost to history. They were preserved in a new form, in the foundational narratives of a people who would, in turn, go on to shape the destiny of the world. The long history of the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry was, for a time, a one-sided story. For centuries, our understanding of the conflict was based almost entirely on the cuneiform records of the Mesopotamians, who, in their royal inscriptions and historical texts, portrayed the Elamites as perpetual rivals, treacherous invaders, and ultimately a defeated enemy. The Elamite perspective, their own accounts of their history, their triumphs and their defeats, was lost to us. This all changed in the modern era, with a philological triumph that would give a voice to a lost civilization: the decipherment of the Elamite cuneiform script. The key to unlocking the Elamite language lay not in Mesopotamia, but in the trilingual inscriptions of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Persian kings, who had inherited the administrative and cultural legacy of Elam, commissioned a series of monumental inscriptions that were written in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The most famous of these is the Behistun inscription, a massive text carved into a cliff face in modern-day Iran by King Darius the Great. This inscription, which describes Darius's rise to power, was the Rosetta Stone of the ancient Near East. The decipherment process was a painstaking and collaborative effort that spanned decades. The first breakthrough was made by a number of scholars who, by applying comparative linguistic methods, were able to decipher the Old Persian cuneiform. This was the key that unlocked the rest of the inscription. With the Old Persian text as a guide, scholars were able to identify the corresponding words and phrases in the Elamite and Babylonian texts. This allowed them to systematically reconstruct the Elamite language, its grammar, and its vocabulary. The process was a remarkable feat of intellectual deduction, a triumph of modern philology that would finally give a voice to a lost civilization. The decipherment of the Elamite script had a profound impact on our understanding of the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry. For the first time, we were able to access the Elamite side of the story. Elamite royal inscriptions, administrative texts, and religious compositions, which had for so long been silent, now spoke to us of a proud and powerful people. We learnt of their own claims to legitimacy, their own narratives of victory, and their own perspective on their long rivalry with the Mesopotamians. Elamite texts from the Samashki dynasty, for example, which had been portrayed as a period of chaos and rebellion in Mesopotamian records, were now revealed to be a period of national revival and military strength. The decipherment of the Elamite script thus transformed our understanding of the ancient Near East. It gave a voice to a lost civilization and allowed us to see the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry not as a one-sided story of Mesopotamian triumph, but as a complex and multifaceted conflict between 2 great and enduring civilizations. The decipherment was a triumph of modern scholarship, a testament to the power of philology to resurrect the past and to rewrite history. The long and complex history of the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry, while extensively documented in cuneiform texts, is also powerfully illuminated by the archaeological record. The material culture of both civilizations, from the most mundane pottery fragments to the most monumental city ruins, offers a silent but profound testimony to the centuries of conflict and coexistence that defined their relationship. The discoveries made by modern archaeologists provide a tangible and often more nuanced perspective than the one-sided narratives of royal inscriptions. The city ruins themselves are a primary source of this material evidence. Excavations at sites like Uruk in Mesopotamia and Susa in Elam reveal a parallel yet distinct pattern of urban development. Sumerian cities, with their massive ziggurats and intricate irrigation networks, were a testament to a civilization built on agriculture and centralized administration. Elamite cities, with their fortified acropolis and their strategic placement at the head of mountain passes, were a testament to a civilization built on trade and defense. The destruction layers found at both sites particularly at Susa, after the Assyrian sack, provide a stark physical record of the military confrontations that defined their rivalry. These layers of ash and rubble confirm the ferocity of the conflicts and the cyclical nature of their violence. The material culture of these sites further illustrates their long and complex relationship. The pottery of the two civilizations, while possessing distinct styles and decorative motifs, shows a remarkable degree of cross-pollination. Sumerian pottery, with its geometric patterns and its focus on mass production, is found in Elamite sites, a clear sign of extensive trade and cultural exchange. Elamite pottery, with its more ornate and symbolic designs, is likewise found in Sumerian cities, a testament to the influence of their artistic traditions. The presence of these objects in the archaeological record speaks to a relationship that was not defined solely by warfare, but also by a long history of cultural and commercial interaction. The military artifacts of the two civilizations provide a more direct and tangible record of their rivalry. Sumerian weapons, with their superior bronze technology and their mass production, are a testament to their centralized military machine. Elamite weapons, with their more ornate designs and their focus on individual craftsmanship, are a testament to a culture that was more focused on personal prowess and individual valor. The discovery of these weapons, along with the remains of siege equipment and defensive fortifications, confirms the intensity of the conflicts and the technological sophistication of both sides. The archaeological record also provides a unique glimpse into the moments of coexistence that punctuated the centuries of conflict. The discovery of a bilingual inscription at Susa, a treaty between the two civilizations, is a powerful piece of evidence that confirms a relationship that was not defined solely by military violence, but also by diplomatic exchange. The discovery of a Sumerian temple in an Elamite city, or an Elamite burial in a Sumerian city, speaks to a long history of migration, assimilation, and cultural integration. The archaeological record, therefore, is not a simple story of two rival civilizations. It is a complex and nuanced tale of two peoples who, in their long and complicated history, were bound together by a shared history of conflict and coexistence. The long history of the Sumerian-Elamite wars, with its cycles of conquest and defeat, left an indelible mark not only on the historical record, but also on the epic and mythological narratives of the ancient Near East. These stories, which were transmitted orally and eventually inscribed on cuneiform tablets, served as a powerful cultural repository for the lessons learned from centuries of conflict. They speak to timeless themes of political collapse, divine judgment, and the fragility of civilization, providing a theological and ethical framework for a world defined by unpredictable violence. The most profound of these narratives are the city laments, a genre of Sumerian literature that mourns the fall of great urban centers. The Lament for Ur, for example, is not a simple historical account of a military defeat, but a profound meditation on the nature of a civilization's downfall. It attributes the city's destruction not to the military prowess of the Elamites, but to an act of divine displeasure. The gods, angered by the hubris of the kings and the moral failings of the populace, withdrew their favor and allowed the city to be destroyed. This narrative transformed a military loss into a spiritual lesson, a story of a civilization wrestling with the concept of a curse that had been placed upon them. The Lamentations, therefore, are not just a historical record. They are a theological explanation for the fragility of human institutions. Beyond the laments, the rivalry also found its way into the foundational myths and epics of the region. The story of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, a mythological narrative that predates the historical record, describes a long and protracted rivalry between Uruk and a city in the Elamite highlands. While the narrative is mythological, its themes the struggle for resources, the use of diplomatic envoys, and the ultimate victory of a Sumerian king over his rival in the highlands are a clear reflection of the historical reality of the Sumerian-Elamite conflict. The myth served as a cultural charter, a story that legitimized Sumerian dominance over their eastern neighbors and provided a powerful narrative of a people's enduring superiority. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a foundational text of Mesopotamian civilization, also contains echoes of the conflict. The story's themes of a hero's struggle against external threats and his quest for immortality are a powerful reflection of a society that was acutely aware of its own fragility. Gilgamesh's journey, his battles against monsters, and his ultimate failure to achieve immortality can be read as a metaphor for the cyclical nature of power and the inevitability of a civilization's downfall. The epic, therefore, is not just a story of a hero's journey. It is a profound meditation on the human condition and the fragility of all human institutions, a lesson that was learned from centuries of conflict. These mythological narratives, therefore, were not just stories, they were a cultural and political tool. They provided a theological framework for a world defined by unpredictable violence, and they served as a powerful reminder of the importance of piety, humility, and the enduring power of the gods. The long history of the Sumerian-Elamite wars, with its cycles of conquest and defeat, left an indelible mark on the epic and mythological narratives of the ancient Near East. These stories, which were transmitted orally and eventually inscribed on cuneiform tablets, served as a powerful cultural repository for the lessons learned from centuries of conflict. The long history of the Sumerian-Elamite wars, with its cycles of conquest and defeat, left an indelible mark not only on the historical record, but also on the epic and mythological narratives of the ancient Near East. These stories, which were transmitted orally and eventually inscribed on cuneiform tablets, served as a powerful cultural repository for the lessons learned from centuries of conflict. They speak to timeless themes of political collapse, divine judgment, and the fragility of civilization, providing a theological and ethical framework for a world defined by unpredictable violence. The most profound of these narratives are the city laments, a genre of Sumerian literature that mourns the fall of great urban centers. The lament for Ur, for example, is not a simple historical account of a military defeat, but a profound meditation on the nature of a civilization's downfall. It attributes the city's destruction not to the military prowess of the Elamites, but to an act of divine displeasure. The gods, angered by the hubris of the kings and the moral failings of the populace, withdrew their favor and allowed the city to be destroyed. This narrative transformed a military loss into a spiritual lesson, a story of a civilization wrestling with the concept of a curse that had been placed upon them. The Lamentations, therefore, are not just a historical record. They are a theological explanation for the fragility of human institutions. Beyond the laments, the rivalry also found its way into the foundational myths and epics of the region. The story of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, a mythological narrative that predates the historical record, describes a long and protracted rivalry between Uruk and a city in the Elamite highlands. While the narrative is mythological, its themes, the struggle for resources, the use of diplomatic envoys, and the ultimate victory of a Sumerian king over his rival in the highlands, are a clear reflection of the historical reality of the Sumerian-Elamite conflict. The myth served as a cultural charter, a story that legitimized Sumerian dominance over their eastern neighbors and provided a powerful narrative of a people's enduring superiority. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a foundational text of Mesopotamian civilization, also contains echoes of the conflict. The story's themes of a hero's struggle against external threats and his quest for immortality are a powerful reflection of a society that was acutely aware of its own fragility. Gilgamesh's journey, his battles against monsters, and his ultimate failure to achieve immortality can be read as a metaphor for the cyclical nature of power and the inevitability of a civilization's downfall. The epic, therefore, is not just a story of a hero's journey. It is a profound meditation on the human condition and the fragility of all human institutions, a lesson that was learned from centuries of conflict. These mythological narratives, therefore, were not just stories. They were a cultural and political tool. They provided a theological framework for a world defined by unpredictable violence, and they served as a powerful reminder of the importance of piety, humility, and the enduring power of the gods. The long history of the Sumerian-Elamite wars, with its cycles of conquest and defeat, left an indelible mark on the epic and mythological narratives of the ancient Near East. These stories, which were transmitted orally and eventually inscribed on cuneiform tablets, served as a powerful cultural repository for the lessons learned from centuries of conflict. The long history of the Sumerian-Elamite conflict, which had defined the ancient Near East for over 2 millennia, did not end with a final decisive battle. Instead, it gave way to a new and enduring era of cultural synthesis under the vast umbrella of the Persian Empire. This was a profound historical twist, a final chapter in the ancient rivalry that demonstrated that even the most bitter of enemies can eventually find a path to integration and peaceful coexistence. The conflict, once the oldest and most enduring in human history, was finally brought to a close not through conquest, but through assimilation. The foundation of this new era was laid by the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which, in its conquest of both Mesopotamia and the former Elamite territories, created a single hegemonic state. This was a temporary end to open warfare, but it was not an end to the rivalry. The Persians, with their new capital at Susa, were now the inheritors of the Elamite administrative and cultural legacy, and they were the masters of the Mesopotamian plains. The Babylonians, though subjects of a new empire, maintained their own cultural and political identity, and their priests and scholars continued to harbour a deep resentment against their new rulers. This was a rivalry that had been subsumed into a new and larger imperial project, a tension that would define the internal politics of the Persian Empire for centuries. However, the Persian Empire's approach to governance and cultural integration was a new and revolutionary one. Unlike the Assyrians, who sought to destroy the cultures of their rivals, the Persians sought to absorb and celebrate them. They adopted the administrative and cultural legacies of their defeated rivals, a process that was a profound and ironic historical twist. The Persians, in their new role as rulers of a multi-ethnic empire, recognized the immense value of the administrative and legal systems that the Elamites and Babylonians had developed over a millennium. They adopted the Elamite cuneiform script for their own monumental inscriptions, and they used Elamite and Babylonian scribes and administrators to manage their vast new empire. This cultural synthesis was a deliberate act of political and cultural strategy. By adopting the cultural and administrative legacies of their defeated rivals, the Persians were able to create a sense of shared identity and purpose within their vast empire. The city of Susa, which had for so long been a symbol of Elamite vengeance and Mesopotamian destruction, was rebuilt by the Persian kings as a magnificent imperial capital, a city of grand palaces, monumental gates, and a sophisticated administrative center. The resurrection of Susa as a major imperial center was a powerful physical statement, demonstrating that the Persians had inherited the cultural mantle of the region. The long peace, therefore, was a result of a new imperial ideology that sought to unite rather than to divide. The Persian Empire, with its newfound wealth and power, was able to absorb the cultural and administrative legacies of its defeated rivals, a process that was a profound and ironic historical twist. The conflict, once the world's oldest and most enduring rivalry, was finally brought to a close, not through conquest, but through assimilation. The long peace, therefore, was a testament to the power of cultural integration to heal the wounds of ancient rivalries. The final chapter in the long history of the Sumerian-Elamite conflict was not one of violence, but one of a new and enduring era of peace and coexistence. The empires that rose and fell, the cities that were sacked, and the rivalries that defined an entire era were buried under the sands of time. But in the modern era, a philological and archaeological triumph, the decipherment of the cuneiform script and the systematic recovery of its texts allowed a forgotten world to speak once more. The enduring power of these cuneiform tablets lies in their ability to resurrect a lost conflict, providing us with a direct, unmediated window into a forgotten world that shaped the dawn of civilization. The recovery of these tablets was a monumental effort. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists and scholars unearthed hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets from the ruins of ancient cities and libraries in Mesopotamia and Elam. These tablets, which had been baked hard by the fires that destroyed their cities, were a treasure trove of information. They contained royal inscriptions, administrative records, legal codes, and religious compositions, all of which spoke to the long and complex history of the Sumerian-Elamite rivalry. The decipherment of these texts, a painstaking and collaborative effort that spanned decades, was a triumph of modern scholarship that would give a voice to a lost civilization. The cuneiform tablets, now housed in museums and universities around the world, provide a wealth of information about the conflict. We have detailed accounts of military campaigns and sieges, of diplomatic exchanges and peace treaties, and of the economic and political tensions that fueled the rivalry. We have the Sumerian king lists, which provide a framework for understanding the emergence of organized governance, and we have the Elamite royal inscriptions, which give us a voice from the highlands. We have the city laments, which provide a theological explanation for the fragility of human institutions, and we have the myth of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, which provides a mythological narrative for the conflict. These tablets, in their totality, provide a comprehensive and multifaceted picture of a long and complex rivalry. The enduring power of these cuneiform tablets lies not just in their historical content, but in their ability to speak to timeless themes. The tablets' accounts of political collapse, divine judgment, and the fragility of human institutions are as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago. They are a powerful reminder of the cyclical nature of power, the inevitability of a civilization's downfall, and the enduring power of human ambition and vengeance. The cuneiform tablets, therefore, are not just historical artifacts. They are a profound cultural repository for the lessons learned from centuries of conflict. The final chapter in the long history of the Sumerian-Elamite conflict is not one of violence, but one of a new and enduring era of peace and coexistence. The conflict, once the world's oldest and most enduring rivalry, was finally brought to a close not through conquest, but through assimilation. The long peace, therefore, was a testament to the power of cultural integration to heal the wounds of ancient rivalries